Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the CSIS DKI APCSS Public Forum on identifying priority issues for ASEAN in 2023. My name is Walfa Karisma, and it is my honor to be your host for today's event. This event is a collaboration between the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in the United States, or the DKI APCSS. The forum today is designed to facilitate discussion between distinguished guests and experts to share their ideas and discuss the way ahead for Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship next year. Before we start our agenda for today, please allow me to warmly greet the honorable speakers and key figures of this event. May I please welcome Dr. Nur Hassan Wirayuda, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia from 2001 and 2009. May I please also welcome Mr. Yusuf Wanandi, Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees at the CSIS Foundation. We also have in attendance today Ms. Clara Juwono, Vice Chair, Board of Directors of CSIS Foundation. And then later on, we'll be joined, I think, with Dr. Rizal Sukma, Senior Fellow at the CSIS Indonesia. And we have Dr. Shafia Muhibat, who will later open the event. She is the Deputy Executive Director for Research, CSIS Indonesia. We also have Dr. Medalina Henditio, Deputy Executive Director for Operations, CSIS Indonesia. And of course, our dear partner, represented by Mr. Peter Gomatautau, the Director of the DKI APCSS that is present today. And next, I would also like to welcome our distinguished speakers and participants who are attending today, as well as the prominent guests that took their time against the traffic to join us today. Now, to open the event, without further ado, may I please invite Dr. Shafia F. Muhibat, the Deputy Executive Director for Research, CSIS Indonesia, to give her welcoming remarks. Dr. Muhibat, the podium is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. I would like to convey our warmest welcome and regards to, first, of course, His Excellency Dr. Hassan Wirayuda, and also Mr. Peter Gomatautau from DKI APCSS. We also have with us here Bapak Yusuf Wanandi, Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees of CSIS Foundation, and Ibu Clara Juwono, Vice Chair of the CSIS Foundation. And of course, our distinguished speakers today, Dr. Rizal Sukma, Dr. Chiang Fanarit, and Dr. Vu Le Tai Huang, and my CSIS colleagues, Lina Alexandra and Andrew Mantong. It is my honor to welcome all of you on behalf of CSIS to today's event, the Public Forum on Identifying Priority Issues for ASEAN in 2023, co-organized by Center for Strategic and International Studies and Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. So we have planned this forum as an avenue to discuss ASEAN and also the critical challenges that ASEAN faces now and will face during Indonesia's chairmanship next year. So I think everyone in Indonesia is currently looking forward to Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship next year. Of course, ASEAN has been one of the most important research focus for us in CSIS since the early days of the Institute's establishment. So of course, we would also like to contribute to enriching Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship next year. And today, of course, among all of the things that we will discuss today, we will definitely need to discuss, ASEAN's relevance in managing pressing issues in the region, as ASEAN has faced various criticisms, specific issues such as how ASEAN can uphold its principles and achieve its objectives in matters such as great power competition and internal problem like the Myanmar Crisis, are some that we hope to be discussed in today's event. I know it's a lot in the agenda, but we do hope that at least we can fulfill some part of it. And for this discussion, we are very privileged to have distinguished speakers with us today, as I have mentioned earlier. So we will start with the keynote speech by His Excellency Hassan Wirayuda, who we hope will outline the traditional and expected role that Indonesia plays in ASEAN, considering the long history and also the challenges that the region faces today. And then a research team from CSIS will convey the result of a regional brainstorming that we had previously, which I think will contain some recommendations for Indonesia in its ASEAN chairmanship next year. And then we will follow by hearing views from our distinguished experts from Indonesia and also regional scholars on issues that they think Indonesia should focus on next year. If you want to make a list of priorities, of course, it will be a very long list, but hopefully today we can really come up with a set of clear priorities that Indonesia should focus on next year. And by listening to these speakers and experts, as well as interaction with the audience, we really hope to get more insights and hopefully valuable recommendations on how Indonesia should prepare and implement agenda as the ASEAN chair next year to deal with the issues that I have mentioned. So on behalf of CSIS, I would like to convey our appreciation to DKI APCSS for their cooperation with us. And I'll very much look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your warm welcoming remarks, Dr. Muhibat. Now, to initiate the discussion ahead, we are honored today to have Dr. Nur Hassan Wirajuda, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, as our keynote speaker. I'm sure we're all familiar with his outstanding achievements as Foreign Minister and beyond, but nonetheless, please allow me to briefly read his bio. Dr. Nur Hassan Wirajuda served as Foreign Minister of Indonesia for 9 years, between 2001 and 2009. Prior to his posting, Dr. Wirajuda has held several important posts, including as Director General for Political Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. And following his tenure as Foreign Minister, he served as member of the Presidential Advisory Council between 2010 and 2014. And he was also part of the member of the Global Commission on Election, Democracy, and Security led by Kofi Annan. He has many achievements, but without further ado, may I please welcome Dr. Hassan Wirajuda to give his keynote speech. Dr. Wirajuda, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, Pak Yusufon Andi, dan Dr. Jose Damuri, the Executive Director of the CSIS, Ibu Clara Yuwono, and Rear Admiral retired Peter Bauma Tautau. I hope I pronounced your names well. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to commend the Daniel Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies and the Center for Strategic Studies as the co-sponsor of this public seminar on identifying priority issues for ASEAN in 2023. This seminar cannot be timelier as we are only a few weeks away from the ASEAN Summit in November, when the baton of ASEAN's chairmanship will be changed hands from Cambodia to Indonesia. The seminar's topic is therefore very relevant. I also wish to thank the co-sponsor for trusting me to deliver a keynote speech and share some of my imaginations on what would be the priority issues of ASEAN under Indonesia's chairmanships. Chairing ASEAN rotates among its 10 members, As such, it involves putting something on the agenda and getting it done with the support of the other member countries. Drawing up the concept is as vital as its effective implementations. Ideally, the chairs should also lead the organizations, although this is not always the case. Under the consensus mode of decision-making, an ASEAN member may also lead or play the leadership role if it can present a good concept. But good concepts are a scarce commodity. That's where the challenge lies. To imagine what ASEAN priority issues should be in 2023, we should understand transparency in ASEAN over the past 2 decades, at least. We can recall that during the 2003 ASEAN Summit, Indonesia hosted in Bali in October that year, ASEAN successfully adopted the Bali Concord II, effectively transforming ASEAN from a rather loose associations into a community with 3 pillars based on politics and security, as well as economics and socio-cultural aspects. It was followed by a rigorous 5-year collective workings process leading to the adoptions of the ASEAN Charter, which came into force in December 2009. Working closely with our dialogue partners brought about ASEAN-China declarations on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, which was signed in 2002. Numerous strategic partnerships and free trade agreements were also signed. This showed that ASEAN was actively consolidating itself to make a cohesive and strong association that is able to play a driving role in the cooperations of the wider East Asia regions. An inclusive and balanced East Asia Summit, whereby it's 16 countries rather than 13, participated at the first East Asia Summit in December 2005, was originally an Indonesian concept, as was the Regional Economic Partnerships, RCEP. This, I should have said, the steps have taken ASEAN to its apogee. Now ASEAN hits its lowest point yet. Over the past decade, ASEAN has been weakened by internal divisions or divisions sown by its own dialogue partners. Phnom Penh debacle of 2012, when the ASEAN Foreign Minister meeting failed to agree its final statement, was a clear example. While Cambodia is not a party to dispute over the South China Sea, the country strongly objected to any mentioning or references related to the South China Sea in the ASEAN Minister meeting final documents. It is clear that on the issue, ASEAN members or the claimant states themselves have no common position on how to approach their adversaries, at least procedurally. This made the opposing party seize the opportunity to advance its positions, conveniently overlooking its repeated claim to support a strong and cohesive ASEAN. Clearly, a divided ASEAN cannot be expected to be in the driving seats of wider cooperations in the regions. The lack of cohesive and strong ASEAN cannot bring about any centrality to the associations. ASEAN commitment under the ASEAN Charter to promote democracy, respect human rights, and rule of laws were undermined by military coup d'etat in 2014 and in 2021. Neither invoked the Charter or the 2004 Vientiane Principles, which do not condone unconstitutional change of governments. Worse still, when the world eyes were on ASEAN to see how the association deals with the crisis, it backed up the arguments that the principle of non-interference of domestic matters come first. The members forgot that the principle must be read in balance with other purposes of the Charter, among them promotions of democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. The excessive interpretations of the principle of non-interference is a good prescription for doing nothing. The use of the Charter, to use the Charter as a yardstick, we have witnessed the lack of progress at best, or even regressions at worst. Under ASEAN Charter, member states solemnly committed to promote democracy, human rights, rule of law, and good governance. It's not my intention to making a laundry list of ASEAN shortcomings. I'm simply trying to make an honest assessment of ASEAN today in order to recommend steps to build a better ASEAN tomorrow. In any case, this has not been a better decade for regional organizations. When the current global order is no longer effective, the world needs a better regional order. We now compare ASEAN with the European Union. The European Union was made a community in 1957, while the ASEAN community was created 53 years later. The European Union evolved into a supranational union in the early 1990s. Yet the EU in the last decade was beset by difficult challenges, such as the rise of toxic nationalisms and increasing populations. The former reared its ugly head with the elections of Ms. Giorgia Meloni as Italy's new prime minister, which in totality at the expense of eroding European values, namely democracy, an open and competitive economy, and human rights. The case of Great Britain leaving the European Union, or called Brexit, is another shortcomings or challenges that Europe's EU has in maintaining the integrity of the Union. Interestingly, in ASEAN, whatever problems we have, no one is interested to live in the organizations. Lastly, about the available policy options and recommendations. There is an urgency to consolidating ASEAN in order to make it cohesive, strong, and credible. Give the most elements that divided ASEAN and that affect the credibility of ASEAN as a matter of priority. Number one, initiate a continuous reform, which is a key to sustainability of any organizations. Demand member states to renew their solemn commitment to the ASEAN Charter, implement the ASEAN community blueprints of those three pillars: political, security, economic, and socio-cultural in a balanced manner, as well as review the effectiveness of all ASEAN-led mechanisms, such as the East Asia Summit, toward balancing their agenda, which so far has been heavily economic and neglecting political and security. Review ASEAN Regional Forum as the sole forum of dialogue on political and security in the Asia-Pacific region, and restrains the appetite to expand its participants, which may lead to a miniature of the United Nations. The crisis in Myanmar deserves ASEAN focus. The ASEAN centrality, credibility, and centrality are at stake here. Not to mention the unmanageable crisis may lead to humanitarian disaster that impact beyond Myanmar and Southeast Asia. Time is of the essence after the chairmanships lapsed with failure in the implementations of the 5-point consensus. The ball would soon come to our laps, which we cannot afford to fail. ASEAN needs to review the 5-point consensus and come up with a fresh and better strategy to move on from the failure under the previous chairs, taking into account the development on the ground in the past 2 years. The Indonesian strategy must be understood as renewed efforts by ASEAN in a long-term, step-by-step process towards a workable solutions for the people of Myanmar and for ASEAN. The status of Special Envoy and its mission must be reviewed. Understanding the complexity of the crisis, the mediation efforts cannot be completed in a single term of chairmanships. And more serious and discreet works then subtle diplomacy of Special Envoy under the glare of the media. Keep in mind that Myanmar in the past 2 decades has become the killing grounds for Special Envoys. 6 of the United Nations Secretary Generals and 2 of ASEAN chairs. I would suggest to call it by other names, but more importantly, equip them with a better operational support mechanisms. The suggested 2 main agenda, as I have outlined, would make a plate for the new ASEAN chair full enough. The problem is that 1 full year of chairmanship is too short to do it all. Thank you very much.
Right. So before you leave the podium, Pak Hasan, I've been informed by Dr. Hasan Wirida, as we have still a bit of time remaining for about, I think, 30 minutes. So if he has informed me that he is willing to entertain a couple of questions from the audience attending today. So if any of the audience today have any questions for Dr. Hasan Wirida, please raise your hand and I'll call you to the microphone to pose your questions. Is anyone willing to ask a question to Dr. Wirida? Please, Dr. Vanner. I think you can use it.
Thank you, Excellency. I'm very grateful to meet you in person and to listen to your wisdom and perspective. My name is Van Ret Chang from Cambodia, Asian Vision Institute. I would like to seek your kind of advice on Myanmar moving forward. You mentioned that a 1 year chairmanship perhaps is not sufficient. So what is your proposal? Second is on the South China Sea. By the end of this year, perhaps the most we can get is a second reading of the Code of Conduct. What is your kind of advice on how we can speed up the process of negotiation on the COC? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van der. Please, Dr. Wirida, I think you can directly answer.
First on Myanmar crisis. Normally, mediation efforts would start when the conflicting parties reach a stalemate. And I think after 2 years, almost 2 years, the conflicting parties in Myanmar reach stalemates. Following February coup d'etat, it was mentioned that there will be civil war. No civil war happens because primarily the NUG and coalition partner do not have enough resources, financial as well as weapons to wage a civil war. But likewise, after almost 2 years, the military still have problems in consolidating its power internally, but also in gaining international support, including from ASEAN. So I see here a window of opening, of opportunity for ASEAN to work seriously on Myanmar. There is a growing impatience within ASEAN after the failure of 2 chairs to implement the 5-point consensus. For that, ASEAN, and in this case, the chair, should draw the fresh approach and good strategy. I mentioned, for example, the nature of spatial envoy, which is failed in the past 2 years because by its very name, spatial envoy, as I mentioned, Myanmar is a killing grounds for special envoy. The UN has sent first special envoy, Tan Sri Razali, followed by Gambari, and another one from India, and the last 2, including the last one, ladies, former Director General of UNSC. But 2 ASEAN special envoys also was not able to perform well in their duties. So drawing a new strategy is key here. That's why we may need to review the 5-point of consensus. Should we, for example, deal simultaneously with all those stakeholders while they are understanding, I mean, the specific interests of both the military and the opposition groups? I think there is signs that having stalemates, they are begin to open their mind to have a degree of intervention from ASEAN in this case. That's why I said as a window of opportunity. On South China Sea, I think there is need for ASEAN and China to renew the dialogue process. The 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties signed by ASEAN members and China was the product of 10 to 15 years of consultations or dialogue, both at track 1, government to government, as well as track 1.5, in particular through the working groups on South China Sea. Recently, to my surprise, and perhaps also by Yusuf Wanandi, the Foreign Ministry of China organized a workshop on 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, to my surprise, because perhaps, and I see as a sign for China to embrace ASEAN. We know the reasons. I was invited as one of the signatories of the 2002 DOC to give 7-minute statements online, and I reminded China on the need to renew the dialogue. And even I shared that in ASEAN, we have problems with regard to the law of the sea on boundaries, for example, but we are diligent in settling the problem through negotiations. And when we fail to settle the problem through negotiations, as mandated by the UN UNCLOS, we created a good habit to refer the case or cases to the International Court of Justice, while none of us actually accepts the compulsory jurisdictions. So why not China? Well, China has 2 judges, respectively at the International Court of Justice and at the International Tribunal of the Sea, to be more open, like we in ASEAN, to settle our differences through the adjudication process. I sense, and I was informed by Yusuf that they are again willing to start the negotiation, the dialogue, at least on the track 1.5 as we had before the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitrations, based on the reference of the Philippines on its case with China to the PCA. So dialogue is the case, and I think there is an opportunity for that matter. On the COC, likewise, COC after 11 years by now, to my view, there's not much substantial progress. Why the problem is that we create norms on norm makings in the midst of the crisis or the increasing tensions. Normally, norms makings would be made before the crisis in order to prevent the crisis. But likewise, when China reached its new status as a superpower, of course, I see the reluctance of China to negotiate, because perhaps they thought, who are you to regulate us? But dialogue has key issues, as was proven in the past, and I believe also the case in the continuing process of COC. But don't expect that we may be able to settle COC as we have not been able to settle in the past 11 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Hasan. Now, I think if you still have time for this, I think we can open for just one more question, if you don't mind. Yeah. Is there any question from the floor? Miss, would you like to ask a question? Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wirayuda, for your presentation. It is such an honor for me to hear your speech directly in person. My name is Mabda, and I am currently working as a researcher for the Hubby Center. And I would like to touch upon your point on how ASEAN should refrain from further expanding and probably risking redundancy in its mechanism. I would just like to probably connect that with Indonesia's quote unquote leadership or Indonesia's initiative to formulate the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Do you see, and with regards to our chairmanship next year, do you see any risks of that outlook bringing in possible redundancy or possible expansion that ASEAN could not make? Bearing in mind that Indo-Pacific itself as a geographical construct spans such a wide area of geography. So I was just thinking, what do you see as what are the risks, potential risk of the outlook bringing in future dialogues that probably ASEAN could not manage? Thank you.
Thank you. What I said earlier was that we need, in a way, to stop expansions of the ASEAN Regional Forum memberships. I think by now we have 28 or 30, and the new applicants are coming, even as far as countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, you name it. I've been very critical on this issue. The problem with ASEAN is every chairmanship wishes to do something new. So they will be proud to claim that under the chairmanship, new members of ASEAN Regional Forums are added. My question was, in the official discussions, would we make the ASEAN Regional Forums a mini United Nations? ASEAN Regional Forum is a sole forum of dialogue on matters of political and security of the Asia-Pacific regions, not for the countries of the Middle East. When Turkey was allowed to accede to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, it was under the chairmanship of Thailand. My question was, would we allow Botswana in the very corner of Africa to apply, to ratify with a view to join the ASEAN Regional Forum? When I leave office, I heard that countries like Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria are also interested. So there's a false expectation here. That's why I see the need for continuous reform, including reform on many of what is called ASEAN-led mechanism. We're good in creating new mechanisms, but often we forget to make it more effective and efficient and effective. On the expansion of ASEAN, the ASEAN Charter clearly defines ASEAN as an organization for countries of Southeast Asia. And in fact, it is spelled out in the Charter as well as in the previous Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, that it is a forum or organization for countries of Southeast Asia. But in the new charter of 2009, there is an article of provisions on new memberships. Again, must be Southeast Asia. And now in a real practice, real case, East Timor submitted its application to join ASEAN when Indonesia chaired ASEAN in 2011. Clearly, East Timor is part or geographically part of Southeast Asia. How can it not? Because the western part of East Timor is part of Southeast Asia. Papua New Guinea has strong interest to join ASEAN many years ago. But in the discussion on the charter, in the drafting process of the charter, I reminded that a country cannot be a member of two regional organizations. And Papua New Guinea is an active member of the Pacific Islands Forum. Therefore, in my view, cannot be, while Papua New Guinea being a hub of Papua and West Papua is part of Southeast Asia, for that matter. Papua New Guinea geographically can be categorized as Southeast Asia. But Papua New Guinea is a member of PIF. In fact, I reminded Ramos Horta, then as foreign minister, don't play around with, because Timor-Leste was at one point said that if ASEAN would not accept East Timor, they would join PIF, Pacific Island Forum. I said, better not say that openly, because otherwise it will be used by some ASEAN member to exclude East Timor from ASEAN memberships. In the upcoming chairmanships of Indonesia, I believe the questions of membership of Timor-Leste would again be raised, and Timor-Leste rely very much on the active support of Indonesia. There is some small problem, hopefully we'll be able to, but things in larger geopolitical terms, you can imagine, and perhaps we should say to Singapore, this has been in a way opposed to membership, potential memberships of Timor-Leste, if only that Timor-Leste opted to have China develops its military base in Timor-Leste. What would ASEAN and Australia would think about it? So it's not a question whether East Timor or Timor-Leste is poor or not, but greater strategic calculation has to be made here, rather than simply on a dollar and cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pak Hassan, for your time. May I please invite the audience for a round of applause for Dr. Hassan Wirajuda. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Pak. Next, we will now proceed to our next agenda. The next session will begin with a presentation from our CSIS team, followed by presentations from our distinguished speakers and discussions. The session will be chaired by Dr. Lina Alexandra, the head of the Department of International Relations in CSIS Indonesia. And also our panelists have kindly agreed to take questions from our audience later, both here at the West End and online. For those online, your questions will be curated and relayed by the team to our moderator. May I please warmly welcome you, Dr. Alexandra, to the stage. Dr. Alexandra, you may take the stage. And the panelists, may I also ask that you please proceed together to the stage. Yep, the panelists, go ahead. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, yep. Bapak Rizal Sukma, you may join the stage.
All right. Good afternoon once again, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to our public forum today on identifying priority issues for ASEAN in 2023. Allow me to share some of the key results of our workshop last month. We had an internal brainstorming sessions with colleagues and experts from the Southeast Asia region, particularly, to discuss about these priority issues for Indonesia chairmanship, particularly in ASEAN in next year. And there are two major topics that we discussed in the internal brainstorming last time. The first one, it's on ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, how to make it an actionable one. And the second one is about reforming ASEAN. And my colleague Andrew will share later about that. I will share more on the actionable ASEAN outlook in the Pacific. And I think it's always enlightening to hear remarks from Pak Hassan Wirajuda. And I think the last question has provided a nice segue for me to share the result from our discussion last month. I just want to underline what Pak Hassan mentioned earlier, that ASEAN has unfortunately reached its lowest end this time. And one of the factors is the division, the weakening of internal resilience, or the unity of ASEAN. including by the division shown by its dialogue partners. And this is rightly taking place in the Indo-Pacific context. So on one hand, I think we all agree that ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is a very much needed document, because AOIP defines ASEAN's viewpoints on the concept of Indo-Pacific in navigating between the challenges and opportunities presented by the geopolitical and geo-economic dynamics in the region, in Indo-Pacific, which these viewpoints hopefully can contribute to the creation of the new regional order, as Pa Hasan pointed out. However, there has been deep concern that AOIP is not moving anywhere. And in the discussion, we identified at least 5 reasons why AOIP has not moved forward so far. The first one, we have to admit that AOIP is not an actionable document itself, because it neither shares strategies nor concrete steps to realize the outlook itself. Second is the problem of ownership and sense of belonging from ASEAN member state itself. It is still very much treated as one member state's initiative rather than a collective initiative. The third is the lack of resources invested to the idea, with difficulties to earn large support from the dialogue partners, because dialogue partners prefer to create their own unilateral initiatives. The fourth, the idea to revive the concept of comprehensive security in the region, on the one hand, is good. However, it is also met with member states' difficulties in addressing hard security issues. In addition, there is no vision of revising the current version of AOIP, despite the need for Indonesia to address more urgent and critical issues, such as major power rivalries. The fifth, AOIP has been hindered by the so-called ASEAN way or ASEAN consensus, which exposes AOIP's limited ability to lay out strategies to tackle various long-term security issues. And from the brainstorming session, there are some recommendations on how to make an actionable AOIP. The first is to narrow down the broad topics mentioned in the AOIP into specific and immediate areas of cooperation, such as supply chain resilience, digitalization, to close the gap of digitalization, to address the food security issue, trade facilitation, to deal with the impact of climate change, and also to tackle the issue related to maritime security for the medium-term plan rather than the long-term one. And the other recommendation is to identify the existing mechanism within ASEAN to avoid overlapping roles. And the participants agree to somehow for ASEAN to streamline the existing mechanisms, to pick and choose which one to be strengthened, which one is the relevant ones to be strengthened, such as East Asia Summit and ASEAN +3. And Pa Hasan has elaborated eloquently in his keynote speech earlier. And also, I think to pick up from what Pa Hasan mentioned earlier, also, instead of creating new institution or expanding one with wrong expectation, such as IRF, I think there are more important avenues that can be strengthened rather than the one that is actually not moving anywhere. And on the one hand, revitalizing the ASEAN Maritime Forum could be an option to facilitate the currently non-existent body in ASEAN that exclusively deal with maritime cooperation. This is something needed, but I think we all agree that the focus should be directed mainly to restore ASEAN centrality, again, by revitalizing the mechanism that is very relevant, such as ASEAN +3 and East Asia Summit. To conclude, ASEAN should work immediately to create modality for AOIP. It is not to say that AOIP is irrelevant, but it is very urgent to come up with concrete steps to make it an actionable one. So I stop my presentation there, and Andrew will continue with the ASEAN reformation issue.
Thank you, Malina. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Andrew Mantong. I'm a researcher with the Department of International Relations, CSIS. As previously has been mentioned by Dr. Lina Alexandra, we had a brainstorming session last month here at Westin Hotel. We gathered inputs from regional scholars from almost each of ASEAN member states, ASEAN countries. And one of the issues that we are focusing as a simulation of what ASEAN needs at the moment is the issues of Myanmar crisis. So the idea is, how can we move forward from the crisis and probably reform ASEAN to become a more rule-based community? So when Myanmar military launched a coup in early 2021, there were some concerns in the region that the situation in that particular ASEAN member states can deteriorate to the level of prolonged humanitarian and political crisis. And more than a year after the coup now, ASEAN leaders have agreed on the 5-point consensus, the ASEAN 5-point consensus. But the crisis in Myanmar is far from over. The crisis, however, happens particularly in the time when great power competitions intensifies, both at global and regional level. While there is no credible deterrence against the Myanmar junta, the current military ruling in Myanmar might also be convinced that international balance of power and the regional balance of power do not work in favor of the opposition and protesters in Myanmar. We are no longer talking about the principles like, for example, R2P, responsibility to protect. And we are now witnessing a stalemate and deeply fractured Myanmar state. The hope has always been high for ASEAN in this matter to play a leading role in solving the crisis. But none seems to be interested to spend too much cost to intervene in Myanmar in the place where they do really think that they have no country have direct national interest. And if country plays at the ground of Myanmar, they carry at the risk of having an open great power clashes in a probably proxy war if the conflict erupts in Myanmar that involves great power. However, given today's situation, what have gone wrong for ASEAN so far? ASEAN has agreed on the 5-point consensus, but the time that ASEAN took to arrive at the decision, which is the consensus among ASEAN leaders, was too long. In a time of crisis like Myanmar, timing is important before political crisis turns into violent clashes between contending parties in Myanmar. ASEAN has been criticized so far for not having sufficient agility and clear mechanism on crisis management to handle situation like this. The current ASEAN Charter has stipulated some rules if dispute happens in ASEAN, but if we define crisis as relatively short-term event involving ASEAN member states or more than one ASEAN member states on issues that threatens the regional stability, organization, or considered as a severe breach of the Charter's provision, the ASEAN Charter has yet to dedicate a codified rules or dedicated a chapter on crisis management. ASEAN response so far for Myanmar crisis arguably have exhausted almost of the list of what ASEAN can do, can normally do as an institution. We can debate whether they are optimized enough or not, but all points in the list were checked that would include Article 5, Article 7, Article 20, and specific reference on the ASEAN Chair on the Article 32. And long story short of these rules are this. They include an emergency situation being addressed by ASEAN through the ASEAN Summit decision and a chair of ASEAN providing a good office to respond to urgent crisis. But here is now the problem for Myanmar. Referring to an ASEAN Summit requires long process if ASEAN only follows normal procedures. And a good office provided by any chair shall be effective and timely according to the Charter, especially Article 32. But it is always up to the interpretation of the ASEAN chair. So ASEAN, therefore, in this regards, need to strengthen the way the organization works. First, With regards to the decision-making procedures, if principles of consensus remain intact, ASEAN should work better, faster, and more timely in making effective consultation prior to the consensus. And second, in the time of crisis, ASEAN Secretariat and the Secretary General should function not only as the secretary, but also as the general. And they should be able to apply crucial first option, while foreign ministers can decide by consensus on the emergency of the event. ASEAN therefore need to empower the office of the Secretary General and professionalize his or her deputy beyond merely political appointees and appointing real experts on issues that has been tasked for them. The office should become more agile in performing fact-finding tasks and making reports and recommendations to be decided at a more appropriate level. Staffing and budgeting will also eventually matter to support a more agile office. ASEAN should then also distinguish crisis management from dispute settlement mechanism, and especially think more about consequences of not abiding the ASEAN consensus, as like for example, the 5-point consensus. Things like temporary suspensions of rights and privileges of any concerned member states may now be talked more explicitly. Beyond crisis management issues, ASEAN should also think about dealing with multidimensional issues that have multiple consequences, such as maritime security and safety, cyber security and cyber governance, supply chain security and sustainability, the climate change and natural disaster. And these issues can lead to major crises due to several reasons, from great power competition to internal vulnerabilities of ASEAN member states. Cross-pillar coordination between 3 ASEAN pillars of the ASEAN community should be more well addressed to anticipate security consequences and governance necessities of these issues. And the last point is about Indonesia's role as an ASEAN chair. Indonesia's role as the chair of ASEAN is much expected in addressing these issues. First, Indonesia must have a clear and immediate measures to deal with the Myanmar crisis. Second, if necessary, Indonesia must lead ASEAN to strengthen effectiveness of ASEAN mechanism in dealing with crisis. Range of options may include revising the charter or at the maximum level, or revising the interpretation of the charter by making protocols and guidelines, or even making the most benefit of the new events, like for example, making the new ASEAN post-2025 community vision. Indonesia should also remind that when Indonesia ratified the ASEAN Charter back then, the law explained that promotion and protection of human rights by effectively functioning human rights body, enforcement of sanctions towards a serious breach and non-compliance against the ASEAN Charter, including suspensions of rights to membership of society in ASEAN, shall be done and revisited immediately. And it is clearly stipulated on the law of number 38 of 2008. Either way, any alternative the Indonesia choose, political will as well as agenda setting is necessary. But even so, in so doing, a large consultation process to convince each ASEAN member states about these issues should be done through informal and proactive diplomatic efforts. And last but not least, Jakarta should also bear in mind that innovation on the institutional bidding of ASEAN has always become Indonesia's portfolio in ASEAN so far. In time of double challenge of the great power competition and the pressing internal challenge, Jakarta will need extra efforts to keep such legacy of Indonesian regional diplomacy alive in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So now I'd like to invite Ambassador Dr. Rizal Sukma, our senior fellow from CSIS, to share probably some inputs about these findings, as well as, the topic itself on priority issues for ASEAN in 2023. To share the view from Indonesia. So about 15 minutes, Pak Rizal.
Well, thank you, Lina. A very good afternoon to all of you. And Pak Hasan, terima kasih tadi paparannya, Pak Yusuf. I'm almost running out of ideas when, I was asked to talk about, ASEAN. A lot of has been said over and over and over. But let's try, something. a lot of people, including Lina just now, mentioned that, and Andrew also, that the key challenge for ASEAN is as if it is a centrality. In my view, it is not. You're not at the center of things. You're just kidding yourself. So ASEAN is basically kidding itself by claiming that it is at the center of everything. And then that's why ASEAN needs to maintain and sustain centrality. It is not, that is not the problem. So the problem is really how to stay relevant. So the preservation of relevance is actually the key challenge that ASEAN faces. I completely agree with Pa Hasan when Pa Hasan said that today we are seeing an ASEAN at the lowest, I think, point, in time, starting from probably 67 even, since the birth of ASEAN. So that relates to the questions of relevance. What does it mean, when we talk about ASEAN relevance? Of course, the relevance issue relates to the questions of the ability to address problems, to address challenges, the ability to deliver, what it's set out, to achieve, and so on. ASEAN, in my view, in the first probably 50 years or so, already achieved a lot, so especially when ASEAN was formed in, late 60s, one of the key objectives was to stop and prevent interstate war among members, and then to create an environment where each member state, would be able to focus on economic development. So that was the original, I think, objective of ASEAN. Probably Pa Yusuf can, highlight it more later on that, because Pa Yusuf was present at the creation. And then we succeeded in that, because today probably it's become unthinkable, that ASEAN member state would use war as the instrument to resolve problems or differences. So in that context, ASEAN has kept its promise to be, a true interstate organization, which would, I think, which would avoid the use of force in order to resolve our problems. But of course, now the challenges that ASEAN face goes beyond, creating a peaceful environment at the interstate level, in order, to do development for each member state. So the ability to address problems, new problems, become the key, to address the key challenge, which is how to stay relevant. So what are the problems? I can only identify three key challenges or problems that ASEAN face. Number one, of course, on top of the mind of every Southeast Asian, citizen, on how to recover, from this post-pandemic, economic, the economic recovery or the post-pandemic era. So that, I think, is very high on the agenda, on the top of mind of any ASEAN citizen. So economic recovery is, I think, number one problems that ASEAN need to address. The ability to address that means that ASEAN is still relevant. And then ASEAN has to prove that it is relevant, then, solve this post-pandemic economic problem, through the economic recovery. The second problem, how to navigate, the great power competition or rivalry, including in the South China Sea and so on the maritime domain and so on, and how within that context we can preserve the strategic autonomy of not only ASEAN but also the whole Southeast Asia. That's the second problems that ASEAN need to address, then it will become relevant. The third challenge, the problem is, of course, internal crisis, in ASEAN member state. Well, of course, Myanmar, is really high on the agenda, but there are also a few other issues. But, at this time, I think Myanmar is the most crucial issue, the internal crisis that ASEAN need to really address. So that, it can claim that it will continue to be relevant. That relates to the second point I would like to mention, which is what are the agenda for 2023 then? If we really understand that the key problem for ASEAN is not centrality, but the ability to sustain and maintain relevance, then what does ASEAN need, to focus on in 2023? I would say only two, I think, big issue, big agenda that ASEAN need to, consider. Number one, how to deepen the connectivity, within ASEAN, which of course include also the economic recovery, the digital connectivity, food and energy resilience, and this is the orphans of the ASEAN pillars, the multi-layered people's engagement, especially the so-called promise of the people-centered, people-oriented, and so on. The third pillar of ASEAN, the ASEAN social and cultural community. We have to think about how ASEAN can actually refocus its efforts again, to implement the ASEAN social and cultural community blueprint through a platform that can actually accelerate the multi-layered people's engagement. So these are, I think, the first cluster that ASEAN need to focus on, which is need to deepen the connectivity of ASEAN member states. The second cluster is we need to strengthen ASEAN strategic resilience, because it's critical, because it's related to the three problems that I mentioned earlier. If you can still recall, the number one, of course, economic recovery, number two, great power competition, and number three, internal crisis. So within that context, there are a number of agenda that ASEAN has been actually doing. In Hanoi, I think the leaders decided to set up the high-level task force to address one of the key issues that can contribute to the strengthening of the relevance of ASEAN, which is the capacity and institutional effectiveness of ASEAN. Now, in this context, there are two subclusters of issues that ASEAN or Indonesia need to consider, for its chairmanship in 2023. Number one, of course, internally. So we need to look at the decision-making process, the funding issue, the crisis management mechanism, ASEAN organs, and also the importance of probably the need to introduce sanction regimes, for ASEAN. I think Andrew already mentioned a couple of issues, within that cluster. The second cluster, subcluster, of this capacity and institutional effectiveness of ASEAN is the regional architecture issue. I do believe that the 2023 Indonesia's chairmanship need to push ASEAN member states to really try to institutionalize the East Asia Summit further, because this is the forum where all the leaders, all the countries in Indo-Pacific or in Asia Pacific has a seat around the table, which I think need to be empowered in order to become a premier platform or process in the regions to address all these strategic challenges that we face. The second cluster, Myanmar, of course. To be frank, I'm not sure that there is a clear or the light at the end of the tunnel, Pak Hasan. Yes, the five-point consensus actually is there, but I think everyone is struggling on how to implement it. So the questions for Indonesia as a chair later on, how should we approach this particular issue? Should we try to do the three, the cessation of violence, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and the all-inclusive dialogue, as one by one, or should we just jump, to the third one, all-inclusive dialogue? Because the junta, will actually organize the election next year. So I think it will be difficult for Indonesia if Indonesia as a chair doesn't have any opinion. Should we say yes to the election or should we reject it? So I think that is quite a sensitive issue. So Indonesia need to formulate, its thinking on this. So my suggestion is that we should just jump to the all-inclusive dialogue and try to prepare groundwork in order to facilitate dialogue. If there is election or there is no election, that's up to the Burmese people themselves. So everybody should accept the fact that they need to sit and then have dialogue and then try to find a political settlement, to the current problem. And then ASEAN only facilitate. So because whatever they decide, it should be Myanmar led and should be also Myanmar owned. That's the phrase of our foreign minister. She loved to cite that. But the question is that, when should we start that diplomatic groundwork? I think it's not after we start taking over, but it should begin yesterday. So that's work to provide the foundation in order to facilitate the internal dialogue. And I think Indonesia does have experience. Not only, people often refer to the experience of Indonesia in addressing the Cambodia problem, but I think there are also other regional conflicts that we played role in facilitating to find the the solution. So bottom line is that we need to reset the 5-point consensus, including, of course, the role of the envoy and so on. So I think the whole design, of 2021, but it's actually designed in order to fail. I can say that, because how can you solve Myanmar problem if the envoy only 1 year? Then how can you solve the Myanmar problem if the ASEAN chair appoint ASEAN chair to be the special envoy to the ASEAN chair in order to report to the ASEAN chair? It's ridiculous, so that's what it says in the current, term of reference of the ASEAN guidelines in order to address the problem. So the ASEAN envoy, should be the envoy should be the ASEAN envoy. Should not be the envoy of the ASEAN chair. No, otherwise you have to change the chair. The chair change every year, and then the envoy must change as well, every year. Jadi nggak ada yang mau. Nobody wants to be the the envoy, because everybody, as long as they're thinking, they know that if they become the envoy, then they're ready to fail. So that's why I think Pak Hasan warned us, that look, we thought revising this, then it's just no way. So what my worry is that what's happening now is the normalization of the military junta in Myanmar. At the end, everybody get tired, and then I suspect the statement is saying that, I don't know, probably Payayan can clarify this, when Ibu Menlu says that ASEAN should not be taken hostage to by Myanmar problem. What does it mean? We just sideline the problem, normalize it, accept whatever is taking place, or just kick Myanmar out, take Timor-Leste in. So that's, I think, the option that we need to consider. Yeah, the South China Sea, that's also a critical problem. I think it's quite, I agree with, I think, Fanarit, you mentioned that the best that we can do, second reading. Yeah, well, it's a bit hard. Who is the coordinator of ASEAN-China relation? Myanmar, for God's sake. So, and then if you let the junta to facilitate, initiate this, then you basically give a degree of legitimacy and acceptance of the junta. So that's why Indonesia insists the process must be moved to the ASEAN Secretariat. So we hope that before the Cambodia chairmanship, ends, that Cambodia can support Indonesia in this context. Just tell all the other ASEAN members, let's move to the ASEAN Secretariat, not to Jakarta, to the ASEAN Secretariat. I don't know where it is. Block M, Block M. Just call it Block M. It's not. Don't call it Jakarta. If you say Jakarta, some countries might object, but just say Block M. Everybody loves that area. The fourth issue, Timor-Leste membership. Ramos Horta, when he met with President Jokowi at the press conference, he said he thinks it's easier to go to heaven rather than to be a member of ASEAN. So for how long that we want the Timor-Leste to wait? So I think it is time for Cambodia to do a waiver for us, because, well, we were bad, since 75, of course. But, we really want Timor-Leste to be a member of ASEAN. If Cambodia can just push, and I think Prime Minister Hussein is in the position to do this, he like to push, right? And then push other ASEAN member states to just say yes, especially push Singapore, to say yes. And then by the time we chair, then we can welcome Timor-Leste, into the summit that is going to be organized, probably in April and also in November next year. So that would be, I think, wonderful. So because other deliverables is very difficult. This is the easiest one. Just say yes, and then we can celebrate. At least one out of 6 problems that we are facing, we have a concrete result. The last one is actually the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific operationalization. So I leave that to Lina, because it would be very difficult to operationalize it. Because, when we wrote that, we didn't have on how to operationalize it, in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Farisal. I think Indonesian now put very high standard, set up very high standard, and I believe if all the recommendations from Farisal follow up, be followed up by the government, I think it will be it will be very, very meaningful chairmanship next year. So now I would like to invite Dr. Fu Le Tai Hong, Director General from the Institute for Foreign Policy and Strategic Studies from the Diplomatic.
Working. Hello. 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 Dear participants, dear colleagues in ASEAN, first of all, may I express my sincere thanks to CSIS Indonesia and to the APCSS for having me today at this, I think, a very critical forum at a very critical juncture for ASEAN. Even though, you know, we still have about 3 months to go until the chairmanship of ASEAN, but, you know, having this kind of conversation well before the start of a new chairman of ASEAN, I think is very necessary practice. And I thank you, the two institutions, for this fantastic idea. My job is much easier now. Because, you know, I can't agree more with, you know, the keynote speech by Foreign Minister Hassan and also my Indonesian colleagues. I myself think that, you know, we, all of us in this room, share our love for ASEAN. And I think that, you know, the reason why we have to struggle so much and debate so much about the challenges confronting ASEAN at this point in time is because of our love for ASEAN. It's because of our very wish to see, you know, ASEAN, you know, united, central, useful, relevant, not only, you know, for ASEAN member states, but also for our dialogue partners and for the region and the international community. So having said that, I think, you know, before going to the specific solutions or suggestions, which I share a lot with my ASEAN colleagues and Indonesian colleagues, I think it's also better to have a, you know, to have a what I call, you know, cold-blooded assessment of the regional and global situation that we are living in, and also our prediction about what would be unfolding in 2023. My observation is that, you know, ASEAN, we all are living in an era of unprecedented changes, discontinuities, and also transformations. You know, the COVID-19 is still, you know, dragging on and exerting, you know, comprehensive impacts on our life. You know, the major power competition will be here for long. And even after the upcoming Party Congress in China and the midterm elections in the US, I think this bilateral competition will be the order of the day, and will, you know, will be the key factor that affects the strategic environment of ASEAN for a long time to come. I don't think it would be a new Cold War between the US and China. I think there are some red lines for this competition. And the two powers have already made clear that they don't want to seek confrontation, direct confrontation. They want to maintain dialogues, and they want to work on, you know, issues of shared concerns, including global challenges. So I think that, you know, in 2033 and afterwards, these two powers may be seeking a new balancing point, a new kind of modus vivendi in their bilateral relationship. I think that would very much affect, you know, ASEAN in that way. People also talk about Russia as, you know, the third factor in this major power competition. And, you know, the conflict in Ukraine is still, you know, unfolding. But I don't think Russia would be, you know, an important player in, you know, our region. Even, you know, irrespective of what, you know, the outcomes of the conflict. But, you know, the US and China would be the key factors that affect our environment. We also witnessed, the fourth crisis in the Taiwan Straits. Would also, I think, this crisis also opened up, a new normal, a new status quo in the region. And, many people keep, raising the question of how and when, Taiwan would be, taken over by the mainland China in the future. And I think, this would, directly affect, the strategic environment in our region. At the same time, people also mentioned about, the current situation in the South China Sea. Some may see that, the situation seems to be calm at this point in time because, the global attention seems to be, distracted, to, the conflict in Ukraine or the Taiwan crisis. But I think, the undercurrents in the South China Sea, seem to be very complicated. So that we need to be to keep watching. At the same time, we also have the problem of, Myanmar in our region. And I think, the biggest non-known, the biggest abnormal, about this situation is the absence of Myanmar from ASEAN meetings. And, the hindrance of this factor, for ASEAN to move forward any, regional cooperation agenda. So I think this should be a serious issue to consider if we do really want to continue excluding Myanmar from our upcoming meetings. ASEAN, Myanmar, used to be isolated before, a very long time, and it took a very long time to continue with our dialogue efforts and to engage Myanmar in our regional projects. So think about that. If we would like, to leave our regional agenda, hijacked, by, this issue, in the coming year. Meanwhile, we still have a lot of other things to do, in our region. At the same time, the post-COVID era also opens up, new trends and new, transformations in our region. For example, the predominant trend for, digital economy, digitalization, for the green and sustainable economy, for more sustainable, supply chains, food security, energy security, the French shoring, trend, now, in the region. So that's another, trend that would affect ASEAN. And finally, I think, not only ASEAN, but many other multilateral fora also suffer from, the major power competition and seem to be in a common mood of crisis, at this point in time. But I see a new trend of what I call, minilateral and, 3 or 4 party cooperation arrangements, which are mushrooming, around the world and also in our region. At the same time, the major powers also come out with, many new initiatives. And I think, these new initiatives are also, loosely connected, single issue based, or, a very specific issue based. And, the participation, is also very open and very flexible. So this is the new trend that we need to consider. So this is the overall, picture. And I think that would pose both opportunities and challenges for ASEAN across the board, not only in terms of, strategic soul searching for ASEAN, after 55 years in experience, in existence, also pose, both challenges and opportunities to the community building process. For example, we are now discussing the post-2025 vision. And, it's also, affects our external relations with our dialogue partners, particularly how to deal with, the ongoing major power competition, and lastly, how to maintain our centrality, in region. Of course, many people now debate about what centrality truly means, after many decades of mentioning about that concept. And I agree with Raizan that, centrality essentially means, relevance and usefulness for our member states and for our dialogue partners. So how to maintain that in, the current context. So, but I'm an optimist about ASEAN, and I think, and I'm also, happy to see how Cambodia would fulfill successfully its chairmanship in 2022. And I also wish you good luck with the G20 summit also. And I am very much confident about Indonesia's natural leadership within ASEAN and its, long-term vision as a founding member of ASEAN for next year. So I try to be, both visionary and, realistic at the same time, about how to help ASEAN, cope better with, the existing challenges, and how to manage expectations, right expectations about ASEAN. Having said that, I think I will come up with, many of my suggestions, overlap with my colleagues here. Try to come up with some very specific recommendations. Number one, I think it's time to revisit some of the fundamental documents of ASEAN and to revitalize them in the light of the new context. For example, Indonesia is the founding father of the Bali Concord processes. You had Bali Concord 1, Bali Concord 2, and Bali Concord 3 in 2011. So I think it's about time next year for Indonesia to come up with Bali Concord 4 in the new context. Revisiting, Bali Concord 3, I found them very interesting. Many, elements in there are still relevant in today's world. And even further back, the TAC still has very potent, tools and elements in there that we can apply in dealing with current challenges. For example, with the ongoing negotiation on the COC, for example. So why not revitalize the TAC as an overriding mechanism, to deal with the South China Sea, as also an alternative, mechanism to deal with the South China Sea issue, for example. So that's one suggestion. The second suggestion, regarding the AOIP, I largely agree with Lina suggestions, and I think I agree that it's time to operationalize the OIP, but the problem is how. The challenge is how. So I also agree that it's time. AOIP already contains very fundamental principles, and also our outlook of the Indo-Pacific region. Let's keep them intact. Don't touch, those things. I think it's about time to select a couple of workable or feasible projects or issues, and let for example some ministerial meetings talk about that, how to implement just one or two flagship projects focusing on the issues of popular concern now, and also the interest that meet the interest of our dialogue partners also, and engage them in those projects. So so that's my suggestion. the next issue is, it's time to finalize, the community vision for post 2025 period. I think ASEAN could play a very pivotal role in this process. You can start with the ASEAN mechanisms to draft the vision, and ASEAN, I think, could play a leading role in making this a real document soon next year. For the Myanmar issue, I already talked about my approach to this issue. So think about the absence, the very diverse, very harmful effects, the absence of Myanmar at our ASEAN meetings. And as seen in 2022, the absence of Myanmar already obstructed the implementation or the progress of our regional agenda. So I hope that Indonesia would come up a solution to deal with this issue. I also would like to draw your attention to the issue of the sub-Mekong region. You already mentioned about the issue of the South China Sea already, and I agree with that. But I think the sub-Mekong region should not be a sole issue of the mainland Southeast Asia. If we consider ASEAN as a holistic strategic theater and a community building process, the issue of the Mekong sub-region should not be left out, for only mainland Southeast Asian countries to deal with. And I think we should not only mention about functional and technical cooperation in the sub-Mekong region, but also, strategic aspects of this issue. Let's have our foreign ministers and even our leaders discuss this issue, at the ASEAN forums, next year. And ASEAN, ASEAN would find it very difficult to maintain its centrality if it ignores the Mekong sub-region. That's what I mean. Another suggestion is that, we think about how to, respond. ASEAN should think about how to respond effectively to the initiatives of the major powers in the region. And also how to work with, existing new mechanisms in the region. For example, how ASEAN would work effectively with the Quad. I know, this is, also still a sensitive issue for ASEAN. But, Quad also covers many issues that the AOIP and ASEAN shares in the region. So think about having a kind of informal dialogue between ASEAN and the Quad members. Not only, all of the Quad members, but maybe, it could also be one or two Quad members to talk about some, possible projects, for our region. And at the same time, I think ASEAN also needs to have a new economic cooperation strategy in the region. Again, in the context of, the disconnected supply chains or food security or energy security, and how to adapt our standards to, the new standards of, of the region and the world, especially, with the IPEF discussion going on, with the CPTPP, with the RCEP, with the GDI or the BRI of China, for example. So we should think about our standards and our approach to these standards. As the last point, next year, I'm looking forward to a synergy between the ASEAN Chairmanship of ASEAN and the APEC Chairmanship of the US in the 2023. So I think ASEAN and the US should take this opportunity to to realize what we call the comprehensive strategic partnership, which would become a reality later this year. And this year would be very important, for ASEAN and APEC under the chairmanship of Indonesia and the US, to increase our cooperation. So those are some remarks and recommendations for your reference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fu. I think your point about the strategic soul searching for ASEAN is really echo the previous recommendations as well. And you raised about the point about sub-Mekong region. And this is something really very important point as well, because again, as you said, ASEAN needs to be holistic in its initiatives. Last but not least, of course, I would like to invite Dr. Chiang Vanarit, the president of the Asian Vision Institute. And your institution based in Cambodia, and Cambodia is the current chair of ASEAN. Particularly about the request about Timor-Leste earlier, and probably you can share your view about this, the input for the priorities for next year. Please, Vanarit.
Thank you very much, Lina. Would like to thank the co-organizers for inviting me, and it's my pleasure and honor to join this distinguished panelists. I would like to frame my intervention based on Pak Rizal Sukma, the three challenges that you raised. And I just would like to add one more challenge to realize sustainable development goals. 8 more years to go. Time is running out. And I commend Indonesia as the chair of G20 summit this year, have put this SDG at the front and center. And also highlight the key priority under each pillar, the 16 pillar SDG, which I find is very interesting. Because chairmanship of ASEAN is about continuity. You cannot reinvent the whole wheel. Cambodia chairmanship also continuity from Brunei, and Indonesia chairmanship will also continue implementing the agreements that we have this year. So before the 55th ASEAN Foreign Minister meeting in Phnom Penh in August, I think many policy makers and think tankers did not expect to be successful. We calculated maybe we could not issue any joint statement, could not manage to issue any joint statement. So it kind of quite pessimistic, but also prepare for the worst case scenario. So there are different scenarios that they already prepared. But I think it's kind of lucky or fortunate that they could have a breakthrough to issue many joint statements on common issue that our region is facing. So learning from the foreign minister meetings and lately on economic minister meetings and energy minister meetings, I think we quite a bit more optimistic now with regards to the upcoming ASEAN summit in this November. So the most concern at this stage is Asia summit. ASEAN summit, perhaps we could deal with it, no problem. Statements, consensus building, but East Asia summit, perhaps the risk is about 70% that we would fail. But we still have 30% of chance that we could succeed at the East Asia summit. So those are the ongoing events. On just quickly on East Timor, Cambodia was very supportive and work a lot behind the scenes to convince all ASEAN member states to support the membership of East Timor. So according to what I heard is perhaps November this year, we will officially announce the membership of East Timor, and the official ceremony will take place in Indonesia. So that is kind of one of the key highlights of the Cambodia chairmanship this year, to include the new members of ASEAN. Okay, with regards to the challenges Pak Rizal mentioned earlier, recovery from the pandemic. Yes, I shared with you. That is the concern of the ASEAN people. We need to understand the sentiments and the social need of the people on the ground, not the elites. What are the sentiment and social needs? So this is part of social innovation process. Or we need to apply behavior insight in order to design our policy at the national and regional level. So I wish that perhaps ASEAN, we should have a design thinking and innovation and leadership so that we can better understand social needs and use it as a basis and foundation to develop our regional agenda at ASEAN level. So I agree, the recovery is very essential and that is the top priority. But we need to ensure that our recovery is green, sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. So we need to add those adjective qualifying words to the recovery itself. So green, this year, Prime Minister Hun Sen proposed ASEAN Green Deal. Actually, we don't have any concept paper yet, but it's just a political statement, ASEAN Green Deal. And he asked the ASEAN Economic Club, which was just established on the 12th September. And I myself is one of the members of the ASEAN Economic Club. Now it's still in the process of drafting ASEAN Green Deal. And we need to read EU Green Deal. We need to read ASEAN Circular Economy adopted 2 years ago and other related materials on ASEAN Green Deal and submit to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister Office perhaps next month, October, on concept note ASEAN Green Deal. So this is perhaps something that Indonesia can continue implementing by developing action plans or cooperation framework on how we can realize ASEAN Green Deal to make our recovery green. And one more thing is ESG, environmental social governance approach toward this kind of a public-private partnership and also foreign direct investment or even domestic investment. ESG is something that new to us, ASEAN, and my institute have proposed this to the Cambodian government, but I think so far only the parliament recognized the importance of ESG, and we will have a draft resolution for IPA, and we will have ESG there, part of inclusive green economic recovery. We work with the Ministry of Environment Cambodia to push this agenda, but the lack of capacity and understanding of ESG remain limited. So I hope that Indonesia can push this agenda forward, ESG investment, green financing, and green investment project within Southeast Asia. Second, the third point within the recovery I want to add here is RCEP. Well, we start in force, come into force early this year, but we need to speed up the implementation of RCEP to make it more impactful on the people on the ground, especially SME, small, medium enterprises. So how we can build the capacity of SME to seize the opportunity from RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So that is, I think, perhaps next year can push more on this, the involvement of SME in the RCEP process. That is the challenge number one that Pak Rizal mentioned. Navigate great power rivalries. This is very important. I think it's priority number two. I share the view with our colleagues here that operationalize AOIP. I'm quite optimistic about AOIP actually. We have room to play. We have strategic space to play actually. Now we get some endorsement, political endorsement from some of our dialogue partners already. Next step is to operationalize it because this is kind of a gradual process. First, you need to have a political commitment and endorsement first, and then go to action plan and implementation. So I think from next year can be a good year to operationalize OIP after we gain quite significant political capital that we need in order to operationalize AOIP. The TAC, I'm not sure whether we should revisit, but I just enforce it is not to revise it, but to enforce it because I think I'll call a lot of signatory, I think 40 plus now, 40 already a signatory to TAC, but we need to figure out how to enforce it. The TAC. Revitalize, not revise. Okay, sorry. So revitalize, not revise, but because so revitalize is to energize, to enforce the TAC. And in another is a zone of peace and neutrality, so fun, right? And ASEAN nuclear weapon zone first, the free zone. So those are also other kind of legal instrument that we need to enforce, because to navigate great power rivalry, one of the best solution for us is rule-based international order. How to bind all these major power to respect international law. And we have some legal instrument in hand, and we need to socialize those norms and rules, and then how to say, not to force, but also to convince major powers to respect rule-based international order. And we should not be shy away from the word rule-based international order. It depends on how do we define it. Some people refrain from using it because Russia and China against the word rule-based international order, and they prefer to use international order based on international law. But we can define a rule-based international order, the ASEAN version of rule-based international order. So we need to, I think this is the most important strategy for us to navigate the great powers rivalry. And then second point is in this navigation is we need to promote open, inclusive multilateral system or multilateralism. If you look, the world now is multilateralism is in decline. I think we need to show up, and ASEAN can be a kind of a catalyst of this open, inclusive multilateralism. So these are the two ways that we can navigate a great power rivalries. The fourth point on internal crisis, Myanmar issue. There are some news from some of colleagues that perhaps Cambodia would be allowed to extend this task even during Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN, but maybe still continue the envoy stuff. The ASEAN special envoy still as a Cambodian, because perhaps this is a hot stone issue, you know, no one want to touch it. Hot potato issue you can eat, you know, like what Prime Minister Hun Sen used to say, hot potato you still can eat, but hot stone no one want to touch it. So, okay, let's leave Myanmar to Cambodia for 1 more year or something. Hot stone issue. Actually, quite exhausted already, Cambodian chairmanship, when dealing with the Myanmar issue. But we don't give up hope. We hang on to it. Try to create hope, you know. So that is the trajectory, and the visit of the working group last week. Not so good yet, but we expect a miracle, a major breakthrough. But they still waiting for the reaction from Tamadao. If the positive, then the third visit of special envoy will take place next month, maybe mid-October or late October. But if no miracle, no breakthrough, no more visit. It costs a lot of money, you know, a few millions already, and the Cambodian already complained that we spend a lot of money on this special envoy stuff. But the result is not yet there. So we hope for the miracle within maybe this next week or so. So that if there's positive response, because Cambodia set a lot of conditions. Now it's no longer diplomatic. Now it's at the stage of frank conversation. The first two stage is diplomatic stage to understand each other, but now it's about direct talk and very frank, and a lot of conditions. And they did not share with me, but they told that a lot of conditions posed on the Tamadao. So wait for their response. If it's positive, so visit. But I think Excellency Hassan mentioned as kind of a stalemate point. Maybe can be an opportunity, but wait and see. 50-50 chance of that. We wait and see to wish all the best on the Myanmar issue. Internal crisis in ASEAN or internal uncertainty in ASEAN also relate to power transition in the member state of ASEAN. From Singapore to Cambodia to Thailand, what's going on now. So this kind of power transition always come along with political risks and uncertainties. So that is something that we need to monitor carefully with regards to the international politic dynamics and how it affect their foreign policy and the ASEAN community and so on. So fourth point, the challenge is Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. So how can we mobilize more our resources and build ASEAN UN partnership? So at the informal meeting in New York lately among the foreign minister ASEAN, I think they set some direction how we can improve ASEAN UN partnership so that we can deal more effectively with global issue and regional issue. And lastly, I want to add here the ASEAN Global Dialogue, which will be the second one. So 10 years ago, Cambodia organized ASEAN Global Dialogue, invited different major multilateral key stakeholders to attend this dialogue. And this November also we'll have a second one. So this is a dialogue that I think also important to build a global partnership to solve with the issue, because ASEAN alone cannot solve all these major issues. We need to build partnership and with other international institutions and partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vanarit. I think you rightly add issues related to economic priorities and also related to sustainable growth, environment issue, which in RCP definitely, I think something that really need to be added into the priorities for next year. So now we move to the discussion, question and answers. We have around 1 hour to have the discussions, to have questions, comments from the floor. And now I would like to open the floor first for the first 2 questions, and then I will take one from the group, from the YouTube later on. So first round, I think I see one hand over there and at the back. I think you will go next later. Okay, so please identify yourself and briefly state your comment or question, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Andreas Aditya Salim from the Indonesia Ocean Justice Initiative. My question is to all the panelists. I'm fully aware that the title for this discussion is ASEAN in 2023, but allow me to take us to jump to, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, where to a period of time where possibly those hundreds of artificial islands in the South China Sea will be well developed in terms of military or non-military. I somehow believe, I have a strong feeling that those tiny islands, artificial islands, can have a disruptive effect to the, let's say, economic connectivity, the strength of the ASEAN as a region. So what are your views on this, and how then ASEAN in the next chairmanship should respond or should prepare on this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Question from the back.
So thank you very much all the panelists for the excellent presentations. So my name is Aristio. I'm from the International Law Department at Indonesia. So I have a couple of questions. The first question would be, I think all the panelists mentioned on how the issues of how ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific should be operationalized, and that's remain big questions. I think despite the big questions, I think last year Indonesia at the Asia Defense Minister meetings introduced the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific cooperation from a defense perspective. I think that is because of the lack. Sorry about that. I think Indonesia last year introduced the at the ADMM the AOIP from defense perspective. I think that is to answer some criticisms about the current outlook, which is more focused on economic. So my question is going to be for Dr. Lina. I think you mentioned about how ASEAN should operationalize. To what extent do you think Indonesia during the chairmanships going to be put something on the AOIP in the defense perspective? Because of course, I think if we talk about defense perspective, it's going to be a little bit sensitive here in ASEAN. What would be the low-hanging fruit from the ideas, and what would be the limitations of the defense cooperations in ASEAN? And the second questions, I think also this in regards to the South China Sea. I think nearly all of the panelists acknowledge the importance of how ASEAN should maneuver in the South China Sea. But my questions would be, I think with a lot of pessimists about whether or not ASEAN under the Indonesia chairmanships can conclude the COC. Do you think what can we learn from the Cambodian and also the previous chairmanships about press the code of conduct, and what can we do differently in order to maintain peaceful and security in the South China Sea? So that's going to be my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wafa, is there any question from the YouTube? Maybe we can take one.
Yeah. So the question from Zoom, I think if I can summarize well, what would be the strongest but most plausible measure that ASEAN can employ on the Myanmar issue? So some of the question mentioned also something about intervention as well, but of course, you know, what are some of the what does this policy options spectrum look like for Myanmar?
Thank you, Wafa. Okay, I'll take the liberty to answer the question directed to me, but I think the question is actually directed to the panelists here as well, because colleagues, especially from Vietnam and Cambodia, they are very supportive and they quite optimistic about how we can operationalize. Although actually in the brainstorming session that we had last month, we agree not to use the term operationalize, but rather actionable AOIP, because operationalize has a kind of a nuance that to change the nature of AOIP itself, while it is actually, as you can see from the term itself, is an outlook. So it cannot be really operationalized, but we can add some strategies and steps to make it actionable one. So because your question pointed out on the particularly on defense cooperation, and what I can tell you actually from the brainstorming session, we don't really see, because if you see in the document itself, it does not specifically mention about this defense cooperation, but rather, as you said, it's more on the low-hanging fruits. The priority areas, I mean, the maritime cooperation, the SDGs, the economic security, the connectivity issues. So it's a kind of like from the document itself, we can see that it is by design not to actually talk or touch on the defense issue. So I think that's a kind of strategy, although later on, of course, we can move to the harder issue, to the more hard defense issue. So as I said earlier, one of the recommendations really to narrow down the broad topics into addressing urgent, immediate, relevant issues that we are facing in the next, let's say, in the next 3 to 5 years, like the supply chain resilience, the food security issue, the trade facilitation issue, the climate change, as well as the digitalization, and particular or specific maritime security issue. So not necessarily on the defense issue itself. So that's the recommendation. But I think in the longer term, definitely, I think as the concrete steps are being put into the table, and you see that this AOIP is moving, then I think the leaders will then think, okay, this kind of initiative can also touch on the hardcore issues, more on the sensitivity issues like the defense. So I think now I would like to give the chance to maybe Parisal, Dr. Fu, or Vanarit. You want to respond to some of the questions first? I start with Vanarit probably. You want to, yeah.
Thank you for the questions. The future of ASEAN in the next 10, 20 years from now. ASEAN will remain in existence. That is for certainty. It will not collapse. That is quite certain. As Dr. Professor Wu mentioned earlier, that perhaps U.S.-China relation will find equilibrium at certain points within the next 10 years or so. It's kind of the balance or equilibrium. If you study demand and supply curve in economics, you know, changes always lead to equilibrium at one point, but it's a matter of time. Yeah. So that is the trajectory of we will look at. But I think the world is moving toward, or already in the face of a multiplex world, in which a lot of issues are interconnected and multiplicity of issue and multiplicity of actors. So ASEAN can be one of the key actors in this multiplex world that can have certain leverage in shaping regional and global architectures. On AOIP, I agree that actionable specific projects can be carried out. It's because diplomacy is the war of words, you know. It's how you frame it and how you, develop action based on this kind of conceptual or political framework. On the Myanmar issue, a policy option. Well, unfortunately, I don't think we have much option on the table now, except continue engagement and be more creative in a way, or innovative, or even brave a bit to engage the NUG, perhaps, so that create a more, how to say, a more dynamics. We need certain triggers to cause change. So we need to find that trigger to cause change of behavior of the states. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Fu, you want to respond to some of the questions?
I do not intend to address any specific questions, but just to highlight my observation that the reason why I'm optimistic about ASEAN and ASEAN centrality in the current context of the major power competition is that I do not frame the US-China competition as the binary choices. And I think number two, I think ASEAN and middle and small powers have a role to play. We have our agency, we have our bargaining power. And number three, we have our strategic values in the eyes of the major powers. Just look at how ASEAN is framed within all of the versions of the Indo-Pacific strategies, and also in the initiatives of the Chinese or other regional powers also. So that's the reason why I think ASEAN should be proactive and should realize the agency that we have, the bargaining power that we have, and should take a proactive and confident attitude, even within a very amid a very difficult, very complicated situation like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fu. Fariza?
On the questions about the artificial islands, so it will remain artificial. So actually, it doesn't turn a rock, into an island, and nothing changed, with regard to the rights, right, of any one who's doing that or building the artificial island, in terms of the UNCLOS. I think Aristo can, answer that, for one day, it's not about. I think that's the issue, and it is not, I think, only for the ASEAN chair, to respond, especially to ASEAN as a whole. Basically this affect the way ASEAN look at the issue, which I think all of us continue to believe that whatever discussion is taking place between ASEAN and China, the foundation should be the international law, which is the UNCLOS. So it's simple as that. So it doesn't mean suddenly you have like 100 miles, 100 kilometers miles of right, EEZ and so on. So rock is a rock, whether you turn it into an island. Well, of course, we can always try to have a discussion on what environmental impacts, or effects, those initiatives actually might have. So you turn, a rock into an island. Probably, we need to also look at the environmental effects of that undertaking. What to do with South China Sea? Well, I think even though this is not directly related to the South China Sea, I think all the ASEAN member states should continue trying to find ways to resolve the maritime boundaries, delimitation, and so on. Indonesia and Vietnam, for example, is continue working on this. So if we, all the ASEAN countries, can actually get an agreement that we resolve all our boundary issues, that I think, make ASEAN in a better position, a stronger position, to show the world that we basically believe in the international law and that we can resolve all these differences, all the dispute, by negotiation and dialogue. Second, well, it's a bit difficult to expect that the discussion or the negotiation will continue. If some of us still not able to travel, because what I've learned over the last 2 years, and also from what I discussed with friends in the foreign ministry, digital diplomacy is also limited. You cannot actually have a negotiation through Zoom. So you need to sit in a room and then have a negotiation. So within that context, COVID really create this huge barrier to resolve this. That's on the technical issue aside. But on the other hand, the nature of the COC itself also make it difficult for the ASEAN countries and China to come to what we always promise, early conclusion of the COC. So probably we should start thinking, can we have a interim solution? Because one of the key worries, actually, there would be incidents in the South China Sea. For example, one ship's actually fishermen's passing the area, and then another claimant use the water cannon to spray, or use laser to spray on the Coast Guard of other claimant and so on. That can lead to a conflict. So we need to have an interim solution or interim agreement, not solution, to actually address this kind of possible accidents. We have number of agreement already around, the queues, for example, that we can look at those agreement, then try to look at how we can actually learn from it in order to have that interim arrangement, for the South China Sea, in order to prevent incidents in that regard. Myanmar, the immediate solution, non-existent. But there is immediate action that you can take. So this is going to be decided by the leaders in Cambodia. Two options. Number one, non-participation of Myanmar at all level by anybody in any ASEAN meetings. So because today only the understanding is that only the summit and the that they cannot attend. And the junta. But one option that they will be considering at the summit is actually no participation whatsoever, including diplomats cannot come. Not only in the or the summit, also in other meeting of ASEAN. That's one option. The other option is that the junta's representatives still cannot participate, but not only in the summit and in the ASEAN ministerial meeting, but in all ASEAN meetings. But the political, the non-political representative like the DG and so on can participate. So the expansion of the existing arrangement. So this needs to be, I think, decided. I think the leaders also promised. Prime Minister Hussein said that, look, if you don't move forward in order to show us some progress, we will take, a punitive action. So that's, we are all waiting for the November. But the problem is that I'm quite pessimistic in this context. I don't think that the junta, will suddenly, show some progress. So, like, you said very, I think, correctly, well, this junta, they have no problem being isolated. So they love it. If we kick them out, I think they will say, thank you, ASEAN, for leaving me alone. So we have a dilemma also in that context. So it's a bit hard. But I do also think that some of them do, I think, pay attention, or they do care about the international public opinion. Remember Nargis, right? Pa Hassan can tell you a lot of I think a story about Nargis, how at the end, they also start thinking, if the world opinion is turning against them, they might be in trouble as well. So we need to find that kind of space in order to put pressure on, the junta. So otherwise, these problems again, is going to undermine the credential and so on. If we cannot actually address this, then of course, being in this at the center of things will be a laughing stock, by the international world. I would like to comment on the question of how we look at ASEAN and Quad, for example, right? So this is, I think, critical. Why does Quad happen? So that's, I think because all the Quad members are actually part of the East Asia Summit. Probably because the East Asia Summit or ASEAN cannot deliver what they promise, cannot actually provide, things that all other dialogue partners are also looking for. At the end, if let alone the dialogue partners, I am also tired, with all this dialogue, talk. If you ever been to the East Asia Summit or ASEAN Summit, I think once is too many. I admire friends in the foreign ministry. They come every year. But what you witness is basically one leader to the other, they make the same statement for 10 minutes each, and then we are the second row or third row, in the delegation, not start comparing whose English is better.
Thank you, Farisal. Okay, Andrew, you want to add something, please?
I agree with Farisal about there would be no immediate measures that we can take with regards to the Myanmar crisis. And we should also take into account the recent event in Myanmar, which there are two and several activists being put in the death penalty. And what it tells us is probably the military at one point, they're getting more frustrated that they're losing ground in the battle against the protesters. So it might be some cases that military is going even more violent because they are threatened by the dynamics on the ground. And what would be worried about from this reality is the fact that I think if we refer dialogue as Habermas put as move simply by the force of the better argument, there would no ground for better argument for a dialogue like that in Myanmar now, because I think Myanmar junta labeled the protester as terrorists and vice versa. The protester also label the junta as terrorists. And I think with regards to the efforts in establishing a platform for dialogue, that would be also challenging for ASEAN. What would ASEAN needs for that is actually to see, as correctly put by Farisal, what would be decided by the leaders next year. Probably ASEAN should have another consensus on the 5-point consensus to evaluate whether consensus is actually being implemented or not. And after that, I think the homework is still there. We need to come up with a better terms of reference, better design duty of for and so on and so forth, because the task would be hard. It's not going to be finished in 1 year or so on and so forth. And on the questions of defense cooperation, Aristio, you mentioned about the example of the IDMM Plus that Indonesia defense minister put the idea of AOIP on defense for that matters. There are two problems for this. First is any sectoral body in ASEAN is resource dependent of dialogue partners. So any activities are being funded by dialogue partners. We have the initiative, we have the shopping list, but the fund and the resources coming from dialogue partners. So with regards to the question of, I hate to say this again, centrality and so on and so forth, I think this is also been challenging for ASEAN. And that's one thing. Another thing is ASEAN is always operating on the premise that we believe that diplomacy remain intact, that we believe that peace will be sustainable. And I just came back from field research in Indonesia, in Malaysia. The mood is already changing. They are talking about war now. They are talking about Ukraine, and they are talking about anticipating if clash in between Taiwan and China erupts and become a violent conflict. In that situation, what would appear as a strategic autonomy for ASEAN? We at this point only talk about strategic autonomy at diplomatic level. But if it translates into an actual tactical and operational level, how can we move forward? So let's say with regards to defense cooperation, if we are too much resource dependent, how can we manage and come up with our agenda? In this situation, let's say, if a Taiwan conflict happened, the most likely situation would be the blockade being applied by China to prevent Taiwan having supported from the US. So there would be some blockage in the north water of the South China Sea. And what can ASEAN do with that? Should we still continue with joint exercises, with tabletop exercises? And I think that would be the situation when ASEAN strategic autonomy should be translated into an actual defense cooperation. I don't know from this point forward. So it might be that if we want to maintain the strategic autonomy, we should deny for example, Indonesia, the sea lane of communication should be denied from being used by any regional power to launch intervention to the region. But how are we going to do that? Indonesia is an archipelagic country. We can technically close the straits for a certain period of times, but we have to work with, for example, Malaysia and Singapore, because let's say if we talk about the Strait of Malacca area, the most authority falls for Kuala Lumpur in this matter. So there are issues like this that ASEAN should think forward and come up with their own agendas, not too much being dependent and driven by the dialogue partners with regards to IDMM and IDMM+. But of course, at the national level, the defense minister should talk and coordinate closely with the foreign ministers. So at home, we also have the sort of internal coordination that should be resolved before we come up with a better and coherent strategy at regional level. Thank you, Mbak.
Thank you, Andrew. So this is very crucial. I think Pak Rizal mentioned earlier about the need to revisit the funding mechanism within ASEAN and to connect with the idea on how ASEAN should be able to maintain its relevance. I think the issue of funding mechanism to enable ASEAN to fund its own initiative and agenda, while certainly still, of course, welcome the support from dialogue partners, but this should not be the key. That's one issue. And in relation to Myanmar as well, I think the point from Fanarit is also a very strong point that if it remains the chair special envoy, the resources will come mainly from the chair. And it's always, it's always then that will create problem. That's why I think this should be an ASEAN special envoy where the resources should come from the ASEAN rather than from the chair. So this is very, very important, I think. So I will open the second round of the question and answer. Danes first. Mbak Susi. Oh, that's, let me see. Okay. Payan also have one question. Okay, 3 first, and then I'll take the other 3 later on, okay? Okay, I'll take 3 first. I'll skip the Zoom one. I mean, like too many questions here. Okay, Danes first.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the speakers for the presentation and the good explanation regarding identifying priority issues for ASEAN. My name is Muhammad Rifki Daneswara. I'm from Indonesian Institute for Advanced International Studies, or INADIS. I have 2 questions. The first will be for Dr. Rizal Sukma, and the second one will be for Dr. Lina. The first is for Dr. Rizal, is that seeing the lack of progress on the parts of the military junta in Myanmar, is that next year, is that what should Indonesia do in regards to the Myanmar opposition or the NUGs? Because currently the NUGs are behaving more like a shadow government and more not like a rebel group. They have their own government, they have their own permanent representation, and they try to meet with officials from other countries seeking recognition and legitimation. And I understand that in May, Malaysia foreign minister met with their counterpart from NUGs. And Dr. Chiang Van-Aert also said, like, to raise the trigger upon the discussion of solving the conflict in Myanmar. So I would like to ask to Dr. Rizal is that Indonesia presidency, what should Indonesia do in regards to NUG? The second one will be to Dr. Lina. I would like to ask, with Indo-Pacific as a regional construct, seeing a lot of attention, a lot of members outside of Indo-Pacific have their own Indo-Pacific strategy, like France, like Germany and Netherlands. And some of them stated that they respect ASEAN centrality in their own document. I would like to ask is that how the proliferation of Indo-Pacific strategy outside of the region affect ROIP itself? Does it create an urgency for ASEAN to have their own identity on the issue, or does this create a limitation because other countries has explained what they are going to do in regards to Indo-Pacific? That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Yayan from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let me start by congratulating CSIS on the convening of this extremely important event. And I wish to use this opportunity to thank all the speakers for the wonderful ideas and important points. I'm not going to raise any questions here. I just want to benefit from what the keynote speakers, Bapak Hassan Wirayuda, has presented. One of the points that I underline from his presentation is the chairmanship can be more than just chairmanship, it can be leadership as well. And one of the strong points of Indonesia in the past is the intellectual leadership or conceptual leadership. And Pak Hassan says that we can always lead if we have something to present, a good concept. I think this is extremely important. And I thank Ibu Lina and Pak Andrew for the excellent presentations on actionability, not operationalizations of AOIP and the reforms of ASEAN. I just would like to follow up to what our dear colleague said previously. We have been witnessing the proliferations of ideas on Indo-Pacific that include ideas from some European countries. And the idea has been so crowded, and probably this is quite a challenge for Indonesia, it's not only for its actionability, but also to place our concept at the centers of this situation. And of course, the reforms of ASEAN, which include the strengthening of East Asia Summit, as Rizal as well underlined. And from Pak Rizal, I took note of the importance of the concepts of relevance, but I think this is quite pertinent to Indonesia's chairmanships of ASEAN in the next year. The key word here is relevance, and I thank as well Dr. Vu for bringing up the sub-Mekong matter. I think it is almost out of the radars of the discussions within ASEAN. The hydro geopolitics has been expanding in the sub-regions, and even the multilateralism has been expanding as well in the regions, and in what ways that it will erode or strengthen ASEAN's centrality. And to Dr. Fanarit, I thank you as well for bringing up the ideas of that. We need to listen to the heartbeats of the people, the social need of the people. I think this is essential to reflect the message and the theme of the forthcoming chairmanships of Indonesia in ASEAN. Another point from Dr. Fu is synergizing ASEAN with other processes that include APEC next year under the US chairmanships, and of course, in what ways that we can as well respond to the proliferations of IDA that include Global Development Initiative or IFAB, as well as Global Security Initiative that could be put into a more ASEAN response to these proliferations of ideas and initiative in the regions. So again, thank you so much. I have learned a lot, and I have taken note so many important points from your presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Yayan. Mbak Susi?
This is going to be a short one. Thank you for a wonderful meeting like this because it's informative. As an academic, I'm an academic at UI and also a researcher. And I see the identifying priority issues may also involve a redefinition of the middle powers, because it seems that middle powers doesn't affect
whatever a conflict situation we're facing. And that's not even discussed in this forum, except we see the consequences that it's not effective in a sense. What is the usefulness of that conceptualization of middle powers? Maybe somebody can inform me about, maybe we need to problematize the issue academically. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Susi. I will need to take one pressing question from the Zoom, I think. Wafa?
Dr. Alexander. So I've got a question here from Director Faisal Cherry Siddhartha, who is the Director for ASEAN External Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He asked that the issue of ownership of AOIP is not ownership by ASEAN member states, but it's the ownership of all ASEAN dialogue partners. This has made it difficult to mainstream AOIP in some ASEAN-led mechanisms, such as the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN +3. The current situation has become difficult now in developing cooperation in EAS and APT due to the rising tensions in cross-state relations and the war in Ukraine. So what is the strategy to narrow this perception gap, as well as manage growing animosity among ASEAN dialogue partners in order to inclusively implement the AOIP? And so that's the first question. The second question would be, taking into account that there is an increase of the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons in conflicts, is it timely now to revitalize the CHONFES? And how could ASEAN manage the issue? So those are two couple questions.
Okay, thank you for the question. I would like to take up the question directed to me before I ask Parisa to respond to the question about Myanmar and UG. Regarding the effect from Indo-Pacific strategies defined or revealed by other countries, like so many countries, definitely, as Dan has mentioned, they come up with the strategies, while AOIP, as we discussed earlier, has not really come up with concrete steps and strategies. And definitely this will affect. If AOIP remains as it is without moving forward to become an actionable one, I think the major powers, they will certainly impose their own definition. And that actually relates to the point raised by our colleague from the Foreign Ministry earlier, Pak Cherry, about this, because definitely these major powers, they have the capacities, they have very clear interests on what they want to do in the region. And the fact that ASEAN has issued AOIP, that already, gives some optimism, because ASEAN, the good thing with AOIP is definitely because it reveals about the vision of what should be the Indo-Pacific region look like. It's open, it's inclusive, it's some colleagues mentioned it as a rule-based, where ASEAN wants the superpowers, the major powers, all the powers actually observe to the international rules. But then that needs some efforts on how to realize that. And that's why I think this is very, very timely, especially under Indonesia's chairmanship, to really upgrade this AOIP into an actionable one. Otherwise, I think it will be just trampled down by the strategies by different major powers. Definitely, we see some similar visions in the strategies exposed by other major powers and dialogue partners. We certainly can create cooperation, like concrete projects, as mentioned by Vanarit. A lot of concrete projects can be done with collaboration with dialogue partners and so on and so forth. But again, I think this is very important to have a very clear standpoint and come up with the concrete steps that are being defined by ASEAN member state itself. And again, the key is really for ASEAN member states to have ownership to the concept itself. Indonesia came up with the initiative, but it is not only Indonesia's initiative. This should be an ASEAN initiative. That's why ASEAN will need to work together to make it happen. So now I would like to turn to Pak Rizal about the question about the NUG. Should Indonesia engage with NUG just like what Malaysian foreign minister did?
Why turn difficult question to me? Well, no, I think in my presentation, I did mention that, probably it is time for Indonesia to just jump to the third of the three key, initiative that is mandated by the 5-point consensus, which is the inclusive dialogue of all stakeholders. Within that context, there is no other option but to engage not only the Tatmadaw, the junta, but also the NUG and also the ethnic groups and all other, and CSO also as the stakeholders. So that's, I think, engaging NUG through that framework is necessary. So in that context, if Indonesia agree that, it's no way that we can push the junta to stop killing, or, it would be difficult if we just drop the humanitarian assistance to the junta and let junta, distribute it, then, we should at least try the third agenda, the all-inclusive dialogue among all the stakeholders. So within that context, then we have to engage the NUG. But again, I learned from Pak Hassan and others, in foreign ministry, before we jump to that, but of course there should be an informal initiative in order to smoothen the foundations, for that. You cannot just issue invitation that everybody, hopefully will come, to that kind of, dialogue. But you need to do the clandestine, quote unquote, diplomacy first, in order, to make sure everybody agree and can see the point about the importance of that initiative, to be facilitated by ASEAN. Yes, Pak Yayan, there are a lot of ideas on the Indo-Pacific at the moment. You have the Japanese one, you have the American one, you have the Australian one, and then the EU one. But I think for ASEAN, in order to make our ideas or our outlook stand out, then we need to identify how the ASEAN outlook actually differ from the other ideas. So at least I can identify 4 points with the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. But again, other ideas also contain all these, points. Number one, it should be inclusive. Well, probably the US and China, they have different ideas. It should be in order, but one of them should not be in that order. But for ASEAN, it's inclusive. We cannot have regional order without 1 or 2 great powers who have legitimate interest in the region. Zophon already failed because we had this funny idea that in order to preserve stability in Southeast Asia, so we have to keep the great powers outside. That's the idea of Zophon. And then, by 1998, we, after the Cold War, we realized you cannot, keep the great powers outside. So you have to take them in. The ASEAN Regional Forum was born. Then the East Asia Summit was born. Engaging them, all enmeshment kind of strategy that everybody should be here. The more, the merrier. And the more great powers, the more difficult for any great power to dominate. So that's the thinking that has shifted within ASEAN. So, in that context, I think the inclusivity is a must. Number 2, maritime focus. So let's, remember when ASEAN agreed on the idea, the outlook, it's actually, we see the region as a single geopolitical and geoeconomic unit. So it's not merely geographic, ideas. So it's not like, wow, let's bring all the countries, in the so-called Indo-Pacific rim, like in what's called IORA, and then you have everybody turn it into the regional organization. I don't think that we had that idea, that conception at the very beginning. But basically, we know that the space of engagement of Indonesia and also of other countries in the region, in ASEAN, has expanded, not merely on the East Asia, which comprise of Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, but also, on the, you look at the map, on the left side of the map, which include India, because India is important. So this idea of the Indo-Pacific is basically try to understand the reality of the day, in which that the two oceans, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, already form a single geopolitical and geoeconomic unit. So that's why, the competition will take place at sea. So the seascape is more important than the landscape of the Indo-Pacific. So it must have the maritime focus. Not to mention, I think this is a very Indonesia-centric, that we do think this is important in order to realize the global maritime forum idea. I don't know, it's dead now. Well, the idea is good, but it's dead anyway. So that was, I think the beginning of the thinking of the Indonesia's Indo-Pacific outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The third element is it should be cooperative, not competitive. So that's why I think Pak Yayan can probably clarify later that the foreign ministry tried to bring in the four elements of cooperative areas, such as the maritime security, the connectivity, and the economic cooperation, and so on, in the concept paper and also in the statement on the ASEAN outlook. The fourth one, of course, rules-based. By here, is basically we're talking about international law, because international law is the weapon of the weak. So China and the US, they don't need international law, because they're strong, but we are weaker, so we need international law. So we rely on international public opinion. So in that context, it must be based on international law, because in international relation, nobody can impose international. It's an anarchic society. That's what I learned from LSE. No one can dictate. It's different. Middle power concept is interesting concept, but ASEAN is not middle power. It's a power in the middle, of these other great powers. So we can have discussion for 3 or 4 hours on that. But I think it's better to talk to the lecturer, about the interesting part of the middle power, because the common definition is it's a power that can act on its own without any reliance on others. And then I think about it, I don't see any other country, who can actually act on its own without relying on other, actors. So including the US and China, they also need others. So we need to revise that definition of middle power. How to narrow the gap? This is the questions on the what to do because of this rivalry conflict, and then that's why we propose the institutionalization of the East Asia Summit, because this is the place where we can actually try to have civil discussions on key security issues in the region. But if 1 or 2 members of the East Asia Summit do not want to come to this Asia Summit, then of course we should address the underlying reason why a country cannot or doesn't want to participate. Do they think that it will be useless, or do they think that there are other forums better to really address this one? So I think this is on ASEAN, how to make the institution actually useful to address those kind of problem. Nuclear threat. I think, well, the most practical way is actually, I don't think we have to wait for all the nuclear powers, to together, sign the zone phase. So if China is ready, so let China sign it. And then if US ready, then US can sign it. So at the moment, I think ASEAN is of opinion that let's wait all the nuclear powers agree, then they will sign at the same time. That will be the end of the day. Hari Kiamat will, we have to wait until Hari Kiamat for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Farisal. Andrew, you want to add something?
On the question of middle power, allow me to answer a question from my professor here. Mbak Susi is my professor at the University of Indonesia. You asked whether the concept is problematic. Yes, but is it being used? Yes. Some certain dialogue partners of ASEAN do use the rubrics to approach ASEAN and on the rubric of middle power partnerships, like some countries already do for ASEAN. The concept is, I think, if we collect all the literatures on the middle power, is consisted of the essence that there are powers in the middle of the hierarchy between great and lesser power that can perform and provide some sort of public goods to the international system. How they do this? They do this with the power of norms. So they're able to use norms to become powerful, but not powerful to the extent that can write their own norms. So every concept of middle power that I've learned so far, they show that they work on the very assumption that liberal international order remains intact. And countries like Australia, like Korea, for example, they use not to they perform not to write about the grand narrative of the norms, but they work on the technicalities, like for example on trade negotiation and so on and so forth. For now, it is problematic because of the concept of the order. So if we notice that around the track to discussion, CSIS has always engaged, the words of rule-based international order have become prominent after we have Brexit, after we have Trump, after we found the fact that even the proponents of the liberal international order betray the principle of liberalism. That's why we use the terms of rule-based order. The problem for ASEAN, whose rules? Should we write the rules? Are countries like Indonesia, Korea, Australia, Malaysia to some extent able to perform and to supply the public goods for the region where great power are busy for their own affairs? In the past, the most important example is when we are writing TAC, Sunfest, and what else? Zofan, and become applicable to other to the international order. But now, I think in the time when there are erosion to the liberal international order, and we don't find any clear definition of the rule-based order, the most important policy questions for us is, are we able to write the norms? There are some certain opportunities where we can actually perform, like for example, on infrastructure development. Sometimes we are divided whether infrastructure development is more related to the money or to the standards that any development should abide to certain labor, environmental standards, and so on and so forth. There would be some competition on that. ASEAN have come with their own agenda, like for example, RCEP. Probably next year, Indonesia can come up with some ideas to hold, for example, the infrastructure dialogue as initially mentioned by our foreign ministers when they come up with the agenda of AOIP. Can we write that norms to allow us not to become the victim of great power competition with regards to for example, infrastructure development, cyber development, now a pandemic recovery, and so on and so forth. And I think, yes, it is problematic, but there are some policy questions. And I think the most important operational level for us is how can we work with countries like Korea, like Australia, some other dialogue partners of ASEAN that falls into the category of middle power, and most importantly, who always consistently put forward this label to come up with a certain agenda and coherent agenda to contribute to the international system. There would be $1 million questions for me.
Thank you, Andrew. So we come to the last round because we only have 8 minutes to go. So I take 2 questions. Okay, 3, but please be very brief with your question or comment, please. Okay, you go first. Sorry. Please identify yourself. You first, yeah. And then with the orange one later on. Okay.
Okay, thank you, everyone, to the honorable panel in here. First of all, my name is Hino Samuel Jose. I'm from the Ministry of National Development Planning, but I was an intern in Pak Yayan's office in Beskalen. So I want to go directly to my questions related to my previous experience as an intern, actually. And I think Pak Rizal Sukma already mentioned about this during the CSIS 50th anniversary webinar with Pak Martin Natalagawa back then. You say, Pak Rizal, back then, you proposed that we need to strengthen the role of BPPK, now the Beskalen, yeah? So do you think what are the potential low-hanging fruits for the 2023 chairmanship? And the second question to all panel, I think, Indonesia to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, only send the minister of the trade minister, Pak Lufti, back then the Mendak, yeah, to attend the IPEF meeting. Do the panel think that this is already correct, or are we undermining the strategicness of IPF or anything, that's just my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mrs. Speaker. So I'm Richard Sazikri from the University of Indonesia and also from the Indonesian Student Association for International Studies or ISAFIS. So my question is, it's as already been mentioned that there is many issues that should be prioritized in ASEAN in 2023, such as Myanmar, South China Sea, or even the global recession that maybe happen next year. But I want to ask from each speaker personal opinion, which one the issue should be prioritized first? Like we should prioritize Myanmar first, or South China Sea first, or the globalization first, or is there any possibility that each of the issues could be discussed together in one time in the 2023? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Ibu yang di depan tadi. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mabda from the Habib Center. I have two brief questions. The first one would be addressed to all speakers. Bearing in mind that ASEAN foreign ministers have issued the statement on the cross-strait development, I would like to ask if it will be possible for Indonesia, if it were to chair ASEAN, to play any constructive role to directly quote the statement in the case of possible tensions or possible conflict in the future, and how would it look like? And the second one would be addressed to Dr. Sukma. In 2009, you made quite a very remarkable article on Jakarta Post on post-ASEAN foreign policy. I would just like to hear what are your thoughts at the moment, if you were to reflect on your article from 12 years ago, bearing in mind that now we are presiding G20 and we are going to chair ASEAN. I think it's quite an important point to reflect on. What are your thoughts on the point you made 12 years ago? So thank you.
Thank you. Still relevant, ya Pak, ya, I think. Okay, because I haven't seen one question from you, if there's any. Okay, one, very quick, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm Sanyang from Korean Mission to ASEAN. I have one very quick question. So you mentioned about the institutionalization of ASEAN under Indonesia's chairmanship next year. And I think the ASEC role is very, very important. But at the moment, the ASEC role is very much limited to support the CPR here, and mostly like drafting. So how do you see, and what kind of roles do you think what kind of roles to be given to ASEAN Secretariat to empower their roles and function next year? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sun. I would like to invite maybe Dr. Chiang, Dr. Fu, you want to respond first before I give the final to Pak Rizal later, please.
Thank you. I think Indonesia facing with the problem of expectation. There are high expectation on Indonesia. There are low expectation on Cambodia, but Cambodia did what Cambodia did beyond expectation. So how to manage expectation? So that is the leadership of Indonesia as a key founder and a conceptual leader of ASEAN, right? With regards to the question of IPAF or other initiative, I think other panelists here mentioned about money issue. So ASEAN rely on the money from others, dialogue partner. So the question whether this initiative generate revenues, economic incentive, or material incentive or not, that really matter, right? Either IPAF or China Global Development Initiative or Belt and Road Initiative, you can compare which initiative that could benefit more to the kind of a national interest of the member state of ASEAN. Priority issue, I think, is very difficult. Depends on how things evolve next year. Actually, as Dr. Huang mentioned, South China Sea is very kind of undercurrent issue. It may erupt anytime. 10 years ago, 2012, the 45th ASEAN Foreign Minister failed to issue a joint statement because of this tension in the South China Sea, especially between the Philippines and China and Vietnam and China at the time. It's very high tensions there. It's difficult to reach consensus within ASEAN. So it depends. We never know before the East Asia Summit or ASEAN Summit in November. Maybe something may erupt in the South China Sea. So South China Sea become a dominant issue, our shadow other issue. We never know, right? The cross-strait tension, again, I think it's not easy to negotiate the text, the one-page text statement of the cross-strait tension. The language have been worded several times to have a neutral tone, so that the US and China can accept. And if you refer to that statement, I think it's quite a craftsmanship, how they craft the statement, right? Look at the Cambodian chairmanship. I just would like to share that the Prime Minister very flexible, and that flexibility counts a lot. Time limits for 7 minutes for each speakers, but some ministers speak to 30 minutes. But he's fine. Let them speak and exchange views among all these major powers, so that they could feel satisfied with why the reason they come here is to explain. Whether the other party listen or not, they don't care, but they want to explain their position. So as a chair, I think should be more flexible when it comes to timing. Maybe let them speak longer than schedule, and protocol-wise very critical in this time of tension crisis. So protocol, we need to arrange the room, which floor, and don't let them to meet each other, because they don't want to meet, let's say, Russian foreign minister. Dining table, also how we arrange the seat that they don't sit next to each other, because some of the leaders, they don't want to have a photo with some other leaders, for instance. So these are also counts a lot, logistics, protocol, and substance. And to be frank, most of the time the chair spend is on protocol, 70% of the time. Substance maybe 20% on substance. So that is the fact of a chairmanship and of ASEAN. Okay, last point on the again is on the issues of institutionalizing ASEAN. I think this is very critical. But institutionalizing, it all need to come with socializing, need to go hand in hand. Because if you don't understand why does it matter, why we need to change, why we need to reform, there's no movement for reform. We need to create a movement among the policy makers and other stakeholders. We need a movement to institutionalize ASEAN. Thank
you. Final comments. Back to the question of middle powers. I think your question is very relevant. And regarding my earlier observation about ASEAN in the current context of the global power competition, I think I think this is a very valid concept. And we as a single member of ASEAN, we are weak and powerless member. Country, but if we stay together and united as a united ASEAN, cohesive and united ASEAN, we are something in the international relations. And number two, we are still being counted as a very important player, actor, in our region. And number three, the middle powers also conduct what I call niche diplomacy. And by niche diplomacy, I think ASEAN as a whole, has a role to play in promoting dialogue, confidence building measures, and habits of cooperation, or the mediation role, so we have a role to play. And regarding this concept, I also noticed that recently some countries, some middle powers also use the concept of strategic autonomy. Or in ASEAN, there's a new debate on, if ASEAN should pursue strategic autonomy or new non-alignment or, active neutrality. So those questions are being debated not only within the academic circle, but also in the policy-making world as well. So I think your question is quite valid. Thank you.
There have been 3 limited cabinet meetings in Indonesia, talking about the agenda for 2023. So I cannot answer your questions before the government actually officially announce what are the agenda. So I cannot answer which one is a low-hanging fruit before the agenda is known. But I can speculate if Cambodia managed to get Timor-Leste, in by November. One of the lowest, hanging fruit for next year is the logo. All right. So you have to redesign the logo. So Indonesia should be able to do that. Logo of ASEAN. So now it's like 10, but the big one in the middle, right? Then you have to change it. The second one, I think is public knowledge already, that we need to have the post 2025 ASEAN vision. Because in November at the next summit, there would be some recommendations by the high-level task force on the elements of the post 2025 vision of ASEAN. Then I would assume that the real vision will be done during the 2023 or even probably beyond in 2024. So we don't know yet, but that is going to be, I think, a low hanging fruit that is available for ASEAN to pick. But again, number one, depend on Cambodia. Number two, I think depend on how all the other ASEAN countries can actually negotiate on the vision, and then try to come up with agreement. One priority, well, of course, Indonesians have the habit of having 20-25 priorities. So they abuse the word priority, right? Priority usually like 3 or 4 or 5. So in this context, I would go for 5. So in that context, I think Myanmar and the COC equally important, for ASEAN to really address. I know it's difficult, but still it has to be addressed. But I think we need also to look at, what are the issues that need to be changed within the high-level task force work. Or ASEAN's organ is one. So in that context, it would be difficult to change the charter. I don't think the time is enough. I mean, we have enough time, but I think it's more likely or more possible for ASEAN if they think in terms of, drawing protocols on certain aspect of the charter that we think is not detailed enough, right? So, this I think is being discussed also by the high-level task force. For example, on decision making, if you want to suspend, like Myanmar, in the leaders meeting back in April last year, should we allow Myanmar to be in the room as well, to decide, right? Or it should be only 9. If one country that's being discussed, what about that country? Should they also participate in the discussion or not? So that should be spelled out in a protocol on decision making on matters urgent for ASEAN, something like that. On the funding, for example, it says in the charter equal share, right? But it doesn't specify what do we mean when we say equal, in terms like the value of it, like everyone 1 million, or probably if everyone pay 1% of GDP is also equal share, 1%, right? So that need to be discussed and agreed upon, or probably other formula that's being discussed by the ASEAN high-level task force. Whenever you fly to other ASEAN countries, it is compulsory to pay $1, to the ASEAN Secretariat. So all the tourists, in ASEAN member state, will contribute. I mean, $1, if you can pay like $700 to go to Cambodia, then of course $1 is, should not be that difficult. So that's all the ideas that are actually out there is being discussed. So 1 or 2 countries are still reluctant. I don't want to name which country. Well, post ASEAN foreign policy. What I mean at that time is that, by the time, so, we enter the 21st century, most of the national interests of Indonesia that we try to achieve through ASEAN have been fulfilled. So in that context, I think the idea at that time is that, look, ASEAN is still important. I was not advocating that we should exit ASEAN, but we should also balance the multilateral inclination of Indonesia's foreign policy with bilateral, relationship as well. So that's already happening, I think, so since in 2010, 2011. So we try to look at the multilateral, bilateral, ASEAN, or the other forum as simply instrument through which we try to fulfill our national interests. Other countries are also doing exactly the same, So it doesn't mean that, well, if through ASEAN you cannot achieve your interest, then you have to get stuck with ASEAN. So you try to find other, forum, other platform in order to achieve it. So that's the post-ASEAN foreign policy that I meant back in 2009. Well, final point on the strategy. Strategic autonomy is basically hedging. Non-alignment, I don't think it's relevant, the term, but it's in the current application, it's basically strategic hedging. What we are doing, and then what we should really, pursue. So I don't think that non-aligned movement, is still relevant to address the US-China rivalry or US, Russia conflict, and so on. But what we are doing now, non-alignment in the form of strategic hedging. So we try to build good relationship with all the great powers, with all the major powers, because so there is no movement anymore, So, but it's basically the strategic hedging. The term of strategic autonomy means that we should not allow whatever rivalry these great powers, might have to be undertaken in Southeast Asia. So it is our obligation together, to make sure that Southeast Asia will not come back to 1970s, where great powers, try to basically compete for influence in the region. So that's strategic autonomy in current, applicable form, in my view.
Okay, thank you, Bariza. Andrew, very quick on the ASEAN Secretariat.
The problem with the ASEAN Secretariat now is the problem of professionalization, resource, and funding, of course. Funding has been discussed by Pak Rizal before.
More funding, more professional.
That's true. That's right. And the problem with ASEAN Secretariat from our presentations is, I think, related to the two things. The first is regarding to the daily routines, and the second regarding to the crisis management capacity. With regards to daily routines, let's say this: under the political security section, there are only some staff, and they have to deal with thousands of meetings every year. At the same time, if you are dialogue partners, you would propose some kind of ideas for ASEAN, and these ideas should come up with some proposals, right? And the every proposal coming from ASEAN partnership with dialogue partners would be evaluated by this staff. So you can imagine that the amount of time that the staff should work to attend meetings, to make a draft and make a minutes of meetings for each meetings, and then to evaluate the proposal. They certainly need a lot of time, more staff, and so on and so forth. So that's why I think the problem of professionalization is subject to the problem of funding, of course, because you need more resource, you need certain career path. So let's say there are no normal career path in the ASEAN Secretariat. If you want to go up the ladder, you should reapply for another position, and that it creates less incentive of people working and dedicated their time in ASEAN. And with regards to the crisis situations, our initial idea is to enable a role of secretariat that can at least perform some duties related to fact finding. So the performance should look like a knowledge hub first, and should look like an active fact-finding missions. In order to do that, of course, there is the issues of resource and funding. But another issue is probably one of the ideas is to elevate that ASEAN Secretariat cannot work alone. They should be accompanied by at least two related sectoral bodies. With regards to the situation of crisis, I think they can be helped by the existing ASEAN IPR. Then ASEAN IPR should be elevated from merely hosting workshops to become truly fact-finding organizations. So it requires the ASEAN IPR to be moved from the Annex 2 to the Annex 1, so they can work as a sectoral body. And that's the issues of fact-finding. And the another issues is resource mobilization. So let's say the Myanmar junta give access for ASEAN, and the issues is, of course, whose resource and which ASEAN body can work to deal with this sort of mobilization issues. I think the most immediate response would be the AHA Center. But in order to do that, AHA Center should have a clear mandate and should have a certain framework of action on how to mobilize resource from different ASEAN countries. So AHA Center, ASEAN IPR, ASEAN Secretariat should work in synergy in dealing with crisis situation in ASEAN. And crisis will not only be related to example like Myanmar. Of course, there will be crisis on human natural disaster, human-made disaster, earthquake, eruption, and so on and so forth. And also with regards to environmental degradation maybe in the future. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we come to the end of the discussion today. We have very lively discussion, which is very, very good. A lot of interest from the crowd. Please join me to give a round of applause of appreciation to all the panelists. I don't try to make any conclusion because everyone can have your own conclusion about the priorities for Indonesia chairmanship next year. So thank you, and I would like to hand over to our host, Wafa, please.
Thank you for your efforts, Dr. Lina Alexandra, and thank you to all the speakers for their insightful presentations and engaging discussions. May I please invite the panelists back to their seats as we enter the closing session. And to accompany them, please give them another round of applause, please. Thank you again, panelists. Right. Excellencies, it has been a very productive day, but we have come to the end of the event. And to close today's proceedings, may I please warmly invite Director Peter Gomatato, the Director of the DKI APCSS, to deliver his closing remarks. Director Gomatato, the time and podium is yours.
Thank you. What's up? So, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Selamat Siang and aloha. I know it's in the afternoon already and it's been a long piece, but let me try that again. Selamat Siang and aloha. Right on, right on. Well, before I close this out, I really I have to say I've listened to a lot of panels. I've been part of a lot of panels, but I think this one led by Dr. Lina Alexandra and Dr. Alex Matong have been really, really informative, very hard-hitting. The issues were direct, and the folks were very frank and yet very respectful. So well done on that. And you are always, all of you are invited to come to APCSS. If I think all the countries that were represented, there are actually many representation there at fellows at the current course that we had at the comprehensive security course. So that's great. Really, it is on behalf of the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, it's really my honor to provide the closing remarks. I will be very brief on this public forum. First, though, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to His Excellency, Dr. Nur Hassan Miranda, in terms of your really panel members caught on to that. It was very, very powerful. And I also want to recognize Pak Yang, who's also made some great comments this afternoon as well. Pak Yusuf had to leave, but I had lunch with him as well as Ibu Clara, as well as His Excellency Tobing, as well as many other distinguished guests that were at the luncheon. And I do also want to thank CSIS for the tremendous work that they did in leading this effort. It was really wonderful to meet Dr. Shafia Muhilbat, and I would love to really work with you as well in coming to our center and being able to participate in some of our sessions there. Let me just say three observations that I have. The first one is actually very powerful. As I sat here and listened to the very insightful thoughts by the panel, our speaker, those were very, very relevant. They were thought-provoking. They challenged some of the conditions that you have today. They recognized the realism of what we have and what the responsibilities by all ASEAN nations to come together. But what was so powerful about it were the questions that came up. And as I looked at the people asking the questions, a lot of them were very young. And I really want to tell you that. It was very refreshing to see that. It was refreshing to see here in the visible audience, and I can almost imagine in the Zoom session of the young audience. We need the young leaders. Your questions are just as important as the insights that were provided, because you're going to own this. You own it now as well. And I think your perspectives will help generate the, what do we call it? Actionable that you all use, the AIOP actionable. I think you'll be you'll be big in doing that. I think the other thing that struck me, as we talked a lot about ASEAN and where to go, the word relevance stuck out at me in the sense that relevance has to do with not what you say, but how you adapt and make a difference. Your relevance to the 21st century in this complex world that is so dynamic and so fast moving cannot be understated. Diplomacy is great, but diplomacy needs to be underscored by the ability to come together and come to outcomes. Get to outcomes to ensure a peace and prosperous region, particularly here in the Southeast Asia. And then as I close out, I think of something, you know, I hear a lot about countries and its role in terms of where we go in the future. I think that was very evident today. I think the discussion of Cambodia and their role in ASEAN chair, and it's really good to see Dr. Chang again from AVI. We worked very closely together before, and also to be able to see Dr. Vu provide perspectives from Vietnam and working with DAV. I think it's important to note that when we have an opportunity to lead, it does take courage, but it also takes, and this is the most important piece, and that's why I think ASEAN is the way ahead here in the region, and to kind of set the standard to these many complex scenarios we are seeing unfold around the world. It is the collective effort, respect, and understanding that's really going to pave the way. Yes, we need leaders. We need countries to take the step forward. And I love the comment that's made about that Indonesia is not just about chairmanship, it's about leadership. I think that applies to every country in ASEAN. And so that's what I encourage all of you as we close today. Many insights were provided. Many questions were asked. But what's important is for us to define the outcomes by working collaboratively together to ensure that it's not just one or two countries that benefit, is that collectively and generations to come benefit for ensuring that our efforts result in a secure, stable, peaceful, and prosperous region. So once again, on behalf of DKI, APCS, and CSIS, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for the time invested. We applaud all the participation. I also recognize, and I want to recognize, the awesome men and women of CSIS and DKI APCS who are behind the scenes, working very hard to make sure that this event, as well as all of the sessions that led up to this event, was very successful. So let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director Gomatato. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally come to the end of the event. We would like to express our deepest appreciation to our speakers who have taken their time to be with us today. Likewise, we would also like to extend our gratitude to all of our participants who have joined us both on site and online. We sincerely hope that what we've discussed today can play its part in supporting and sparking discussions and pushing for a successful chairmanship next year for Indonesia and of course for ASEAN. For those that can, we encourage you to stay and continue the conversation in the lobby as you enjoy the refreshments that we have prepared for you outside. For those leaving Jakarta, we wish you safe travels back home. And to everyone, we wish you a great rest of the day and thank you so much. We hope to see you all again soon. So thank you and see you next time.